j'ai touché à rien. Normalement, c'est bon.
Oui, oui, bien sûr, bien sûr. Non, non,
Bah, je m'en vais faire comme ça. Je crois qu'on peut démarrer du coup.
Très bien. Bon, merci. Bonjour.
Good afternoon to everyone. Bienvenue, welcome. Thank you for coming and being here today. In the name of the organizing committee, I wish you a very warm welcome here, this very special event with foreign guests within the Bernard Maris chair on this double transition topic of digital and green transition. So if you need headsets for the translation, please get them. They are here at the desk. So we have a very interesting program with 4 presentations from foreign researchers. They're going to deal with these topics. I give the floor to Olivier, who is in charge of the team of the Bernard Maris Chair, to introduce the day. Thank you. Thank you, Luis. So I'm not going to dwell on too long. I'm going to thank you for being here to start with. Despite all the people who are not present because of flu or other viruses, so I had many emails this morning cancelling their presence, and I wish them well. I just want to remind you what is the Bernard Maris Chair, and then I'll give the floor to Olivier Lefebvre from Atecopol. I have inaugurated the Chaire UNESCO in January 2016, the Mairie of Paris, Association Alice and Foundation House of the Science of Man. I wanted to give it a link with Toulouse because Bernard Maris was born and did his first academic career in Toulouse. He was born there, he studied in Toulouse. So the Bernard Maris Chair has since 2018 a double location, Paris and Toulouse. And we need to thank the Région Occitanie and the Department Council of Haute-Garonne, Sciences Po Toulouse, and the label SMX that is supported by University Toulouse-Jean Jaurès. This chair was born from the will to want to honor this wonderful economist, wonderful writer too. And he was also always in polemics, respected colleague and estimated teacher, professor, university professor. And he was assassinated on the 7th of January 2015 at the Charlie Hebdo. There was this murder there, and we thought the best thing was to really combine both aspects of life and work of Bernard Maris to support the academic research in the spirit of liberty and respect. Second aspect, to implement actions to promote the citizens' dialogue between economy, social science, and the city, in the large sense of the city, association, collective, simple citizen, researcher, or academics. Our motto is really pluralism, to have many approaches and many ideas, and also to make things easier and open, to make people to get together when they normally meet. So we want to really make it easier for people to meet and to exchange their views. We have a panel of guests. They are in research programs for analysis of digital topics, and practitioners and researchers who are really interested in green transition or digital transition. And also we have a panel of students, of researchers, university researchers. We're not here to give certainties and to give dogmas, but we're here to say that we want a planet, the planet is getting warmer far too fast, and it is really time to save it. We're therefore here to exchange our ideas and confront them and try to understand all the topics and the problems behind our issue. We want to build a collective of the common good, collective construction of common good. And I would like to thank our guest speakers. I'm going to speak about them now and give them names. We're going to have Olivier Lefebvre to start with, who is head of in charge also of transition economic and social at ENP, Institute of Sciences Politiques in Toulouse. He accepted very lately to represent a research association that is really working very hardly at Ecopol on green issues and ecological transition. I would like to also thank Simon Molines, who is responsible for the Green Pact for the Occitanie region, who is going to tell us about this Green Pact and how it is going to be really cascading down. Then Ron Boschma, of course, really he's in charge of the Bernard Maris chair, in charge of University of Utrecht in Stavanger. He works there. César Hidalgo, who is working at the society, augmented society, at the ANITI, and affiliated teacher of TSC. Also, I would like to thank, I just met her, the teacher Erica Palmer, who is doing his research and at the socio-technical studies for the System Engineering University of Cornell. Then I would like to thank our friend Pierre-Alexandre Balland, because he's really the nitty-gritty of this afternoon's meeting. Is teaching University of Utrecht, but it's also at the ANITI school. The head of ANITI has got flu and he cannot be with us. And as always, I would like to thank those without whom he wouldn't have worked, we couldn't have met. Pierre-Alex, who had the idea to be together this afternoon, and then also Ron, who for his friendship, for all the interest he takes to Toulouse. He fell in love with Toulouse, I think, and then also for the teachers, for the support he gives to the student researchers of EREPS, all the friends of EREPS, Sciences Po Toulouse, all the head personnel, the staff, and executive members. And I would like also to end up thanking our partners for the life of the Chaire Bernard Maris region Occitanie, the Department Council of Haute-Garonne, the SMX label, and the Association Alice. And then other partners who are joining us for this afternoon, ANITI, of course, Digital 113, and the Committee of Transition, Ecological Transition for the Sciences Po Toulouse. And I'd like to thank them for being here. So please do not forget that we're here to debate, to exchange our views, to have a really discussion. And we can carry on this discussion during the cocktail that is organized at 6 o'clock after the meetings. Thank you very much to every one of you.
Bonjour, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci.
Thank you.
Et puis de nous avoir.
Thanks for the presentation and to give us for the opportunity to really give us the opportunity to say a few words. I'm part of the Ecopol, and I would like to tell you why I have been invited to speak. I'm going to share with you the workshop for policies and technology and the environment. We're researchers thinking about environmental issues. So this is the main web page of this site of Ecopol. We have organized seminars on political and ecological issues. The reason why I'm here, I wasn't supposed to be here, but when we got the program at Ecopole, we wondered and we thought, what about the title and a few words of introduction? And the idea of this presentation, that's going to last a few minutes, is really to share with you those points that we wondered about which we wondered, and also how we could debate on them. First element is really the question of a double transition, how to speed up this transition. They take for granted that we need to speed up a digital transition, but why? We thought that was a funny element, and we think it is debatable in society today. Why should we speed up this element, and in what way, if we did? What is a digital transition that will be successful? And that's our next topic. When you think about green and digital transition should have a positive impact on everyday's life for everyday citizens, we wondered whether it was the case for all citizens without any distractions, or whether we could have different elements that could be questioned. And then last point, new technologies, green technologies, contribute to the fight against climate change. Can we say it's the whole of those green technologies that allow to really fight against climatic change? We thought that was a bit quick. And the point on which I would like to insist is really the environmental footprint of digital technology. Before we wonder about speeding up and having a double transition for these digital technologies and green technologies. The first point here, you have a few figures here, which come out from the last project report on the topic. With the consumption of energy in the world linked to digital transactions. It's 5%, represents 5% for primary energy today. And that could really be multiplied by 2 in 10 years. We are talking about very recent technologies, and we have this idea of exponential use of energy. It has an impact on the environment. Digital gives 3 to 4% of greenhouse gases, and it's more than the aviation industry. And the increase rate is more than 6% per year. So we need to really decrease our emission from 4 to 5% per year. So there is a contradiction here in terms. So this energy today, what does it represent? In terms of electricity, we don't produce much today in terms of use. Digital use today represents about 12% of the electrical consumption of today. So our challenge here is to allocate this energy, electrical energy, in our society. What is the digital share? And it's getting bigger and bigger. So this digital, where does it come from? This about its footprint, environmental footprint. There's a production of devices and also the use of those devices. We can say that's about 50% of the energy footprint worldwide, represented by production phase, and 50% on the use. So knowing that then it's going to vary from one country to another according to how the electricity is produced. But it's not the only environmental effect. Also, many resources are taken and used for all these terminals for very, very small resources. Very, very many resources, but very, very small, and that makes the possibilities of recycling very difficult. To recycle these devices is very difficult because they've been put together, and the quantity is so small, and it's not worth it to go and get and recycle those metals. So there's dispersion, loss of rare metals that you find in those devices. And there again, there's an exponential increase of devices. Every year we have a 10% increase rate for the number of digital devices in the world that are really M2M in the internet, and then the increase is really exponential compared to the smartphone market that is saturated. So here it's 2.8% object per person, device per person, and now is 3.6, 30 billion devices in 2023. Few ideas too about flows that are circulating. on these digital networks, and they're not immaterial. You can see you have data centers behind, antennas, and energy that goes then on the device. 3 years ago, in 1 minute on the internet, you have 1 million Facebook login, 3.8 million research for Google, 4.6 million videos YouTube that are being seen, etc. It's 2019, but it is increasing. Those data for big public use, there is no administration scientific research data. So it is a big data here. So what is the footprint in terms of a quantity of data that represents this growth? At the same time is big data and the increase of data. You can see we're in zeta octet, and it is a very high unity. We had 2 in 2002, 64 in 2020, and now we're forecasting 180 in 2025. So we need to store this data, to transport this data. So of course one can optimize things, and that's the idea behind all the work in green IT. So that's the usage of digital technology is greener, but there'll be a bouncing effect, a rebound effect. For the 5G, for example, if you send data on 5G system on the right of this schematic, it consumes a lot less energy than on 4G. But then you're going to transport and transmit many, many more data than in 4G, and it increases more than the efficiency gain. So the use of energy is being increased, so the equation here doesn't work either. So finally, after this short but very fast presentation, I would like to give you a few key messages. The main idea is that the environmental impact of digital is really high and is really increasing very, very highly. So we can't take for granted that optimization are going to be better and take the path of the rebound effect, and that they will be contributing directly to a green transitional issue. So we first have to deal with our digital issues. On more general terms, we can't say that digital is going to reduce the impact of other sectors to really not have to decrease itself. So how can we reduce the impact of digital? And one possibility is to really to think about really degrowing to have a more sober use of digital devices. And even if we didn't agree with that, how can we reduce the impact of digital use today? So I'm going to finish with 3 questions. So we can finish. You can think about that for our debate, to the idea of the green footprint, environmental footprint, sorry, rather than of digital devices, digital use on the environment. How can we think about it? How can we best try to find solutions that will be more compatible with the world where the energy and resources are now constrained? The third point, that is much larger than environmental footprint, will be to asking what will be a successful digital transition for social cultural aspects too. So we should keep that in mind. So that is it for my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Olivier. Now we're going to listen to Simon Moulines, who is responsible for the Green Pact for the Occitanie region. Thank you very much for inviting me, and the region can therefore present all the aspects and actions that really cross those topics of green transition and digital transition. I'm very happy to be here, and this first introduction from Olivier Lefebvre, it really opens me the way to speak about the environmental impact of digital techniques and the crossroad between those two transitions. And Olivier did it very well, so I'm very happy because I don't have to remind you as preliminary remarks. I would like to present to you the way in which Région Occitanie is really grasping this topic. So we have adopted at the region Occitanie, we are working around an approach that is called the Green Pact, and it is a translation simplified of the Green New Deal as it was acted, launched, and really on the other side of the Atlantic by the Democratic Party, and also that echoes the Green New Deal European that was adopted at the last European elections by the new Commission that was formed with Mrs. van der Leyen at its head. So we wanted to launch this idea of the Green Pact following the health crisis in 2020, when we had all the thinking and reflections about what should be the world after the COVID crisis. And it was a topic that we had forgotten since, because one crisis of really chasing another one. What was going to be the world after? And we therefore started many reflections with the local representatives, locally elected representatives, administrative services, but also via citizens' convention at the level of region, Occitanie region, that we founded in October 2020. And it made proposals on different topics that dealt with not just green transition, but that was the target of the citizen convention, but also that made proposal on the model of society. What were the expectations from the people living in Occitanie on the way of life, the needs and connections they might need throughout its transition, and what challenges they had to face on their everyday life. And we wanted to know what were their expectations without going too far, without really knowing what was at stake for the National Convention. But really it was just to have their idea and their thoughts about their way of life in Occitanie. That happened in November 2020. We had many debates with 10 action plans and 5 leverages transitional that we implemented, and leverages aimed at actions and that will have an effect on all the topic actions. And this initial way of doing was completed and modified since the new mandate of Carole Delga at the head of the region, because it is a continuous approach now. That is to say, we try to make all our actions and projects in a coherent manner with ambitions that are not as many as all the plans, are a lot more readable. I'm not going to comment upon this transparency that really is a summary of this Green New Deal and all the list of the 10 action plans and 10 leverages. I would like to attract your attention to the fact that amongst them there's transition, digital transition, and this digital transition that we wanted to put in the Green Deal logic. But the spirit is really to aggregate all different challenges, and sometimes they are contradictory in terms, but we have to make them meet in terms of development and digital development. That can be part of it, because it is a development that is increasing. And one can feel that the economic benefits are there, but they're not as questioned because they're desirable and they are needed. And we think that they are natural and that it's progress, really, and they're not being challenged. So to make it more readable, this list of plans and actions since 2020, end of 2020, we wanted to present this Green Pact according to three markers for the future: the action regarding the climate change, building a society of sobriety with a new model of development, and then the protection of people and everything that is living, and all the human subjects, because the idea is really to establish a link between all these aspects. Behind those topics, we find 6 ambitions. Those 6 ambitions are really talking about the tax policy of Europe, for Europe, that is implemented. We have 6 main objectives that should be really there. It should be present for all the finance plans, public finance plans for Europe, and with the logic that one action should be financed by European funds and public funds should contribute towards one of the 6 objectives without having a bad effect on the other 5 objectives. So the ambitions we have had, they're not really like a Green Deal for Europe, but they are giving energy, and they're boosting topics for health, well-being, integration, and also jobs. That is really not presented like this for the fiscal policy for Europe, and there is not really a topic speaking about social or societal issues. And here we have found all the leverages and also digital transition, including digital transition. And I would like to give you now a few elements about the actions we are carrying out at the regional level. On this question, we have many actions.
And we see this in the different sectorial policies of the region. The idea of this Pacte Vert, Green Pact, is not always to invent something new, but it's just to adjust the policies of the region along the lines of these orientations and ambitions. And this means that we are trying to come up with a certain number of questions pertaining to digital transformation and ecological transition. So, for instance, here we have the question of fighting against electronism within the framework of our youth plan and the work we carry out for helping the younger generations find careers, because we know that whatever the choice made by society for a region, for instance, we are not the only one who determines the space of the digital world in society. But what we see is that as regards access to rights and positions, there is this question of a possible digital divide. There could be a social divide, because everyone is not necessarily comfortable with the digital world, including the younger ones, because we tend to think that this digital divide affects more the elderly, but there are also younger people who have problems with the digital world. And so there are true questions pertaining to education through the digital. What is the age at which you should have access to the digital world? But it is true that when you become an adult and that you're looking for a job nowadays, the question of well, being able to handle digital tools is a question. Then there can be a territorial divide with very standard questions that are also always a question of telecoms that we had even before the digital problems. But some territories are landlocked and do not have access to connections, or maybe sometimes they may be resisting to a certain depopulation or evolution because of territory where you cannot work remotely because of access to high-speed internet, for instance, is problematic, and you cannot enjoy the latest developments of remote working. So this is at the heart of the R&D project that we support. So I talked about these different divides and what we do. So we help the departments who are in charge of rolling out high speeds territories, and then of course we also work on questions such as access to data with Occitanie Data and the development of a data factory. Now here it's the same. The question is, we're not only saying we need more and more data and everyone should have access to it, and data is good per se. No, our approach is to say that at our model level, how can we build the open data logic, which is not the logic of appropriation by the GAFAM. And so we need to maybe think differently this digital transition, because there is the idea where we would say this is a development that we are not interested in because it wouldn't go along the lines of a certain sobriety, energetic or environmental, and therefore this could be done by the major operators who have a model of, the models where they just collect data. And so we need to work on an alternative open data access. And afterwards, regarding the more generally speaking economic aspects in the new economies, we are working on the economical transformation path. So we basically try and cross-cut the two transformations for the new generation. And this is something which will be presented next year with the new regional strategy for employment, sovereignty and ecological transition. This is something which was adopted last week or the previous week, because it was in November. Time flies. And so yes, the idea is we are trying to cross-cut these two dimensions within companies, and these are the elements that we presented previously, and we got a reminder from the responsible development institution that works with the region in order to work towards a more responsible digital labeling. So there are different levels. We are targeting the level 2. I don't remember what it is really, but it's a kind of a commitment gradient. And so we have this labelization level. And of course, it's not only about getting the label, it's all about improving our digital transformation, and I'm talking about what the region can do, the region's services, but also the schools, because you already know that the region leaves a computer available in schools for lycée students. And so, of course, we need to work on managing the hardware, but also the software. And we are thinking about how we're moving more towards open source softwares, or and so we need to think about how we manage this hardware, software, and the digital in our institutions. So these are the different points. I wanted to touch upon. The region is interested in them, and of course I didn't. We're talking about the double transition, and of course we need to help the digital transition, bearing in mind their impact. But there is also the question of what is the input of the digital transformation to the ecological transition, and this was underlined in the previous question. And this is a topic which remains very exploratory, because today within the region we are trying to reach a green budget, so we would like to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from everything we finance, and there are agents in the region that look through the budget of the region, and they qualify what generates greenhouse gas emissions, and we also have a certain number of questions at the regional and local level. But the question is, how can we be more systematic in the way we steer this transition in order to be able to estimate, thanks to management softwares, the impact of our decision on greenhouse gas emissions, but maybe beyond, on questions such as biodiversity, pollution, because it is true that in this respect we do not have enough assessment data and anticipation of this assessment data, and so this is very exploratory. And but here we are. This is something that could be extremely useful for this ecological and digital transformation. This is all I had to say. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Maybe we can move on to Ron's presentation if you have questions as regards these two speakers. Okay, very briefly, otherwise, the question is made off mic. When you calculate the environmental impact, do you take the global production chain, such as plastic for hardware, etc., and also the greenhouse gases that come from the use of electricity? Well, yes, this is the case in the slide that I presented, where there was this pie chart on the one hand production and on the other hand use. So we have the entire chain. There is one aspect remaining. I had 7 to 10 minutes to present this, so there is one aspect I didn't discuss, which is end of life. Because this, I mean, it takes energy to recycle, and there are other questions of environmental pollution beyond the energy, and maybe social and geopolitical question, because so far a lot of our digital waste was just sent to other countries, in Africa, for instance, in open sky landfills. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd have a question to know, do we have any data or means to collect data on recycling and processing these materials, such as rare metals, in Europe? Well, if I'm not mistaken, one of the figures was 16% of smartphones are recycled, but I don't have any figures on the recycling rate. But we can say that these are part of the objects. I mean, the digitals, semiconductors, integrated circuits. This is a sector which is very difficult to recycle, because there are certain metals, and very rare. We have very little quantities under the form of alloys, and it is very difficult to re-extract a milligram of gold, for instance, which would be in such and such a place. However, these are things where it could be interesting to look into in order to improve the recyclability of digital products and design of these digital tools could be adjusted in order to enable recycling afterwards, maybe using fewer resources and because, I mean, why do we need these materials or these alloys? It's be able to make things smaller and smaller. Why smaller and smaller? To have a more power calculation. Now, of course, if we have less, processing capacity, then the object could be bigger, but could be an idea. Yes, as I add to this, these are topics where we've already had players in the sector of re-employment, which structured themselves in regions. I tried to find the name again because there's an ESS company settled close to Montpellier, and they collect smartphones. Now, they work on re-employment, but analytically speaking, it's more interesting, and technically speaking, it's more feasible to reuse parts. But then for the conditioning of these phones, that's another issue. But then we also have several operators in the on the network called Envie, part of the ENSS, that works a lot on what we call the 3 E's. So electronic waste, basically, not only digital, but highly linked to the digital world. Yes, we have commissions to work on this for re-employment. So we do have emerging issues, but there's a true question, a question of collection. I don't have the figure, but I believe we have 2 or 3 phones per person who are somewhere in our drawers. And so if you think about it, you probably have a couple of phones here and there, or your parents. Yeah, we do have quite a lot, and collection rates are fairly low. Yeah, maybe we could move on to the next presentation, and then we will take a break around 4 p.m. Ron, if you would like to take the floor.
I will make you a sign for when you have 5 minutes left.
Sorry?
No, I will make you a sign when we have 5 minutes left.
We are ready?
But go ahead, you have to.
Yeah, the floor.
All right, I can also. Okay, thanks. Well, we are living in a digital world, but you can see there's still problems, very minor problems to solve. Thank you for all being here, and so far I think it was great. The two presentations that I listened to. My name is Ron Bosma. I'm the holder of the Bernard Maris chair, and it's really great to be here and have such great attendance. Of course, I would like to thank the organizers, Olivier and Pierre-Alex in particular, for making this all possible. My intervention would be about the twin transition. We already heard something about it, and to what extent there might also be tensions between the two. So I will devote a bit of attention to that. It's work that that Pierre-Alex and me are doing right now. We're doing a project for the World Bank in which we look at to what extent the twin transition is actually unfolding in Asian countries. So it made us think about the concept of twin transition, how it can be empirically measured, and to what extent we have already some findings to present so far. So first of all, there's a kind of a challenge, right, of the twin transition. I think it became quite obvious already when listening to the previous presentations. Still, there's a very strong policy interest in the twin transition. So the European Commission is very much focused on making this work. They just launched a report on that, and they already developed a lot of policy initiatives to address this. And to me, what I think there are two key motivations behind it. One is that there is a strong belief that the two can reinforce each other, right? So the one can accelerate the other. And the other one is that, and this has already been discussed quite a lot, is that there might be tensions between the two, right? So as we already heard, digital technologies can have pervasive environmental footprints that might go against the targets of the green transition. It has already been mentioned, digital technologies will generate high energy consumption, there's use of natural resources, rare materials, metals that are used for inputs for all those electronic devices, and those are exploited and resourced in very bad labor conditions in countries where they do not respect so much labor regulations. So those two key motivations, I think, are behind this attention to the twin transition in the European Commission. And then the objective of policy is pretty straightforward, right? So first of all, you want to unlock the potential of their interplay, right? If you think they can reinforce each other, we have to define where that is and how that can be done. And policy can make an input in, can make it an effect on that. But also to prevent possible negative effects between the two in terms of the tensions that are around in this twin transition. Of course, this requires a much better understanding of how those two transitions can mutually reinforce each other, right? And there's not so much literature yet on this particular topic. I browsed through it, not that much scientific literature. Yes, there's a lot of literature on the green transition. There's a lot of literature on the digital transition, but the connections between the two, not much attention is yet paid, and I didn't find that many scientific publications on that yet. So there's little knowledge on both issues and how they can reinforce each other. So that makes you think about, how that can be actually done. There's a lot of, in my field, I have a background in regional economics, and I'm dealing with how countries and regions develop economically. When you look at the geography of digital transition, there's not much there. Some recent publications, there's also a geography of green transition, again, very recent publications, but again, they are studied in isolation from each other. So what I would like to address in my talk is the following. First of all, going to explore what type of technologies are required for the twin transition and how the two may interact and feed each other, right? Because that is one of the key motivations I talked about before. How this will have an impact on the ability of regions to move into the digital transition and the green transition, and to exploit potential crossovers between the two, right? So do the two go together when we look at different regions? And as I said, I will present some ongoing work. This is ongoing work. We're still doing the empirical analysis right now. And we have somewhere in that line on the 1st of January, if I'm not wrong. This is a bit of a work of progress, but this is a project that was assigned by the World Bank, in which they wanted to know more about this twin transition, this concept, and how to combine it in Asian countries. So it's also important to make clear what my talk is not about. Although it is important when we talk about the twin transition. First of all, I'm not going to talk about the implementation of the twin transition and how social factors or political factors or economic factors might have an impact on that, because for sure there is an impact, and like social factors, the social acceptance by the population, by citizens, and the participation in that might sure have an impact on the twin transition. My presentation is also not about how digital technologies have an impact on the most greenhouse emitting sectors, right? So such as the energy sector, but also energy intensive sectors, transport sector. I just read a very interesting report by the GRC, has just been published a few weeks ago, in which they go really into detail to what extent digital transition can really help sectors to reduce their greenhouse gas emission by just taking very specific and concrete actions, and where that contribution can be made. So if you're interested in the topic, I would recommend this to read this report. It's a very detailed report that goes into the 5 sectors in which the digital transition can really contribute to all kinds of green objectives that those industries have defined. And my talk will also not be on whether the twin transition has the potential to contribute to the development of lacking region, which is one of my topic that I do a lot of research in, because there's also an issue of inequality and to what extent the green transition might happen in some regions but not in other regions, given the capabilities that they have. So I leave that for further thought and presentations. Okay. When we talk about the twin transition, you have to define the technologies that are that you link to those. Here we have just made a list of technologies that we refer to when we talk about those two transitions. This is the type of technologies that we defined and selected when working on this World Bank report. Well, I don't have to go through all of these. I think many of us can actually link to those quite easily. So I leave it for now. But what we want to use, what we want to do is to use this type of technologies and to see to what extent actually regions have a high potential to participate and contribute to those digital transitions and green transitions. So what we are interested in is to identify diversification opportunities of regions based on the presence of relevant capabilities. So what type of capabilities do you need to move into the green transition, and are they present in a region, and can regions draw on that in order to participate also in the future when developing green technologies. And those capabilities that are around, they provide opportunities, but they set also limits to what can be achieved in these transition processes. So not all regions have strong capabilities to move into green. not all regions have strong capabilities to move into digital technologies. So we have to be very precise and to estimate and to assess which regions can take a lead in that respect and which and in what technologies that actually might take place. So this requires knowledge of the extent to which digital and green actually share similar capabilities, right? So if they can reinforce each other, we really have to define how that can be made possible, and we use a concept of relatedness in order to define that. So the relatedness concept, the principle of relatedness, refers to the fact that activities might share similar capabilities. So if you're strong in one capability, you're better able to move into something new when you can build on existing capabilities with, that you share similar characteristics with. And this has also been referred to as a twin transition space, or the way that we defined it when doing this World Bank report on the twin transition. And just let me, okay, and now I hope I can make it active. Yes, all right. So here you can actually see each dot.
Vous pouvez donc voir ISDOT, c'est la technologie dont je vous ai parlé tout à l'heure. Cette technologie, ce site de technologie verte que je vous ai...
represent those technologies represent the digital technologies. And at first sight, you can actually see that, that there is a cluster of green on the right-hand side of this figure. And on the left-hand side, there are the digital technologies clustered. What this actually shows is that green technologies share similar capabilities, and digital technologies share similar capabilities. But the two types of technologies, at first sight, do not tend to offer too much to each other, right? Well, the twin transition is really about how can we reinforce the two types of technologies and how can they contribute to each other's development. But if you go a bit more into detail, and now this is really nice, right? You can actually see that one digital technology, which is referred to as smart grids, actually makes a connection between digital technologies on the one hand and green technologies on the other end. So this smart grid technology is apparently very crucial in the twin transition, because the capabilities in digital technologies, of some of them, can really be helpful to move into green technologies. And smart grid can be a bridging technology that brings together the two types and enable the twin transition. Of course, you can play around with this, right? So here, for example, you have the example of solar energy, yeah? And if there's a link with other technologies in this space, it means it shares similar capabilities. So you can actually see that solar energy shares capabilities with many other green technologies, right? Like here, like wind energy. I have to put my glasses on. With biofuels, right, batteries, marine and hydrogen energy, geothermal energy, but it is also connected to quantum computers and smart grids, right? So here you can actually have a measure to what extent the two types of technologies can reinforce each other and which technologies can actually support each other's development and enable this twin transition. So we think that could be a major step forward to actually measure this empirically and assess it in certain circumstances. Okay, here I show a graph in which we look at, okay, now I'm missing the title. That's green transition. Okay, great. Because we have a slide on the green transition and the digital transition. This is the green transition. Yes, because the US is shrinking in relative importance. Okay, this shows the period 2004-2021. and to what extent different parts of the world participate in green technologies, right? And as you can actually see, Europe is quite dominant in that respect, right? So we are always complaining that Europe is always behind everything. No, it's not. It's very active and very strong in green technologies, and this is what this slide actually is showing. But you can also see down, right? There is the what is it? The yellow-brown color. That is China and the rise of China. And you can actually see that in the last couple of years, China is rapidly increasing its share in green technologies. So it's really making a big step forward in a very relatively short period of time. The US was important in the past. It's becoming less so in most recent times. Japan is always striking, right? Japan is a very big force in green technology. Although in most recent year, its relative importance is declining. Now we can also see what type of technologies are actually concerned when you look. For example, here we have batteries, right? In the European Union, it takes up 29% of all in the European Union, and it has a share of 21%. So it's very strong in batteries, although, if I recall well, Japan is the one that has shown the strongest capabilities in, I think it's here. Sorry? Here it is. No, that's China. Yellows, of course, yes. Yes, you can actually see that Japan, in that particular green technology, has the highest share worldwide. You can imagine, Japan is not even such a big country, but still it is most pronounced in developing technologies in batteries. Well, again, you can talk for hours on this slide, so but I move on. And now here we go into digital technologies. Here, of course, the US is leading, but I must say I expected it would be much more dominant than is shown here, right? So it takes about 32%, I think, of total patenting in green tech, in digital technologies in 2021. Of course, Europe its relative importance is declining over time, which does not come as a surprise. So this is confirmed also by other studies. But you can actually see again, China is catching up rapidly, and is already doing that for a much longer time, right? If you can remember, they just developed green technologies not that long ago. They started to develop those, but on digital technologies, they're around already for a much longer time, and their global share is increasing in more recent years. And so probably what we expect, and I think this is already true in the last 1 or 2 years, is actually that has the highest share already, and going over the US. Okay. Here again, we can actually see which digital technologies are actually important in that respect. Here we have the US, Internet of Things, very strong. Of course, cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, cloud computing, but also China is closely behind the US in Internet of Things, but also in cybersecurity. So it's really making a big step forwards in a relatively short period of time. Here we have a slide in which we wanted to see to what extent Asian cities perform on both transitions. And on the x-axis you can see the digital transition and to what extent Asian cities participate. Each node stands for one of the 186 cities that are in our sample. And on the y-axis you can see the green transition. So Here we have a number of cities like Shenzhen in China, number 1 in digital, number 3 in green globally. Tokyo, number 1 in green worldwide, in digital ranked 2nd. Seoul, Korea, right, ranked number 3 in green and ranked number 2 in green and number 3 in digital. Okay, sorry, these are the rankings for Asian countries, right? So it's not on the global level. And as you can actually see, is that there is a positive relationship between the two. So if you're strong in the digital transition, you're also strong in the green transition, right? So apparently the twin transition, I mean, in many Asian cities at least, they seem to go together, although we have to go into that much more in detail, but at least these first findings tend to show that. And when you score very low, right, on the digital transition, you also score very low on the green transition. This applies to many cities, for example, in Malaysia, many cities in Vietnam. Well, there's lots of information in this slide, of course, looking the position of every city, Asian city, and how they score on those indicators. So in the end, what we show here is to what extent Asian cities score high both on the green transition and digital transition, and those are colored yellow in this graph. So you have Beijing in China, right? So Shenzhen and Hangzhou, for example, in which the twin transition is actually happening. There are many regions, many Asian cities that lag behind. They score both poorly on the green and the digital transition, but there are, interestingly, also a number of Asian cities that actually do well in the digital transition, but that is not matched by the performance in the green transition. And the other way around, you have a few, and those are all Japanese cities, by the way, that do well in the green transition, but that is not matched by the capacity to move into the digital transition. All right, go back if I can. Now he's annoying again. Yes, now he's listening. Yes, right. It's a bit slow. It's working, but yes. Do you see? Ah, okay. Yes. Okay, now we should be fine. Yeah, thanks. Okay, I've gone through those. Let's skip this one. So apparently, we already saw that for several Asian cities, we can see that the twin transition is actually happening already. For some cities, it's not. But we also wanted to go a bit more into detail. To what extent, if we go in specific cities or regions, what are their opportunities to participate in the twin transition? Because we now just looked at how they perform, but also we wanted to know, do they have a potential to move into those, which builds on the notion that I talked about before, when they have relevant local capabilities that make them possible to move into either the green or the digital transition. So if you have relevant capabilities already in your region, of course, the lower the cost to make this twin transition in your region. So, and this opportunity space, as we will see, will differ between regions very much so. Some regions have capabilities to do so, other regions have not. And in some regions, both transitions may actually reinforce each other, and that is what we try to be after. Well, this is still a bit of work of progress in the Asian project for the World Bank, I can present some work that we did for the European Commission for a number of green technologies and a number of digital technologies for European regions, in which we use these methods to see which regions in Europe have relevant capabilities to move, in this case, hydrogen technology. Which are the regions that have the strongest capabilities? And they might pursue a policy in order to develop those when you can already exploit capabilities that are present in the region. So regions that do not have those capabilities, it would be a waste of public money to develop hydrogen technologies in those regional settings because the cost would be just too high, and the probability that such policy will fail will be extremely high when there are no relevant capabilities around. So here you can have a map of Europe where most potential is available in hydrogen technology. So it's not actually measuring the performance in hydrogen technology, but it shows the potential. Which capabilities do you need in order to move into hydrogen technologies? Here's for battery technologies, right? You can do it for any technology you want, you're interested in, every green technology or every digital technologies. But what is also interesting, what we would like to exploit a bit more also in the future, also in other projects, is that other regions might also offer relevant capabilities, right? So as a region, you might not have everything in-house, but you might also get access to capabilities in other regions in order to make the twin transition. And then the big question is, how can you identify which regions can mean something to another regions to make that happen? So we have done some work on that, also developed some methodology, and what matters is that you need to really be very precise on defining the external linkages that provide access to capabilities in other regions that the region is lacking itself, but that is related to the capabilities that are present in the region. So you can understand the external knowledge and you have the absorptive capacity to exploit that. So this provides key information which relevant potential partners are out there to collaborate with in the future if you, for example, want to go into in a green technology. So here I just took the example of Île-de-France region, right, the Paris region. I call it that region black, and here we provide a map to which where are the relevant capabilities elsewhere in Europe that Île-de-France region is missing, but they have to connect to those regions to get access to those capabilities. And you can actually see that for hydrogen technology, there are quite a number of French regions they can connect to and they can collaborate with in order to develop hydrogen technology in the Île-de-France region. Right? So you can be really precise in linking to other regions, with what regions you should connect. We actually have a data set in where we can see which organizations you have to connect to in order to get access to those complementary capabilities in order to move, in this case, to new hydrogen technologies in the Île-de-France region. Here you can make 10,000 of maps, right? So it's very detailed information here again for Île-de-France region and for battery technology. If they want to develop a policy on developing new battery technologies, they might have some capabilities themselves, but they might also have to look for capabilities elsewhere that they need in order to develop new battery technologies. And here's the map that actually shows where those complementary capabilities are present. And so again, or Macron could develop a policy on that if they really want to go for batteries, or you can make a European program and to see to which regions should actually connect and collaborate in order to make this transition. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Perfect timing. So we have time for questions and comments. Okay. Let me start with.
So Ron, in the work on the twin transition in Asia, you were using patent data, and I was wondering if you also look at, for instance, installed capacity or other output, because one thing is to patent on batteries, another thing is to export batteries, to produce batteries, to put those batteries on cars. So there might be kind of like a mismatch of what is being patented on and the actual productive capacity of the place.
Yes, exactly. So when you look at patents, right, you look at to what extent you have knowledge capabilities, right? And the implementation process, of course, is a different thing, right? So and you need other data in order to exploit that. So that is not part of the study that we are doing, right? So what we are saying actually is, okay, first of all, you need to have a set of knowledge and a set of capabilities in order to make this happen. So if you want to participate in green and digital, an absolute pre-requirement is to have those knowledge creation processes in those particular capabilities. To some extent, I think there is an overlap in the implementation process, right? Because if you have strong capabilities in battery, you probably also have strong capabilities in the implementation of batteries in all kinds of sectors. But of course, you have to be much more precise in that, and you need other data in order to investigate that. But this is, I think, already nice work working with patent data, which tell you already a lot about where the twin transition is actually possible.
Matthew.
Thank you, Ron. Very, very interesting talk. 2 questions, if you allow me. So on the first part of your talk, the one where you were showing those Asian cities which are doing so well, both in green and blue technology, it turned out that so many of them happen to be very populated too. So I'm quite curious as to whether there's some kind of economy of scale that's happening in the background when you benefit from a large local population. So that's my first question. Question 2 is to some extent related to what was asked earlier. The kind of network you pay attention to look at where to look for potential collaboration is definitely based on those patenting network, right? But in reality, there are many other forms of networks that may exist. You might, for instance, be looking into the migration of professionals in a particular sector going elsewhere. You could be looking at the supply chain of one area versus the other trade flows. So have you eventually thought about combining those different networks as a way of figuring out your actual network of potential collaborators?
Yeah, 2 very important questions. Thank you. Yes, I think there's a high correlation with population density. We also made a similar figure here. This is just based on the number of patents in digital technologies and green technologies, but we also controlled for population, right, per capita. So we also look at that. You get kind of similar line, and there's pretty high correlation between the two. That's the second question about other types of networks. Absolutely, that would be very interesting to look at, right? Which of course is nice when you work with patent data. It's easy. Well, it's not easy, but at least those data are available, right? And you can. And this was already a lot of work to territorialize those data because those data are readily available at the country level. But when you have to go to the city level, you have to define the cities first yourself, and then assign patents to each city, which was already tremendous, lots of work. Yes, you're right. I mean, what we could have done also is, but the data I think are not there, is when you look at skills. For example, and what type of skills do you need, and what kind of digital skills or green skills, and to what extent they can actually reinforce each other, right? And you can use the same framework of relatedness in order to calculate that. But how do you get those data at an international scale where you can have comparable data, where you can work on the skill data set? We have been doing those studies, but then we always stick to national data. because then we use microdata in which we can, where we know the skills of every individual, and then we can actually see which skills are related to each other, and then we can apply it to diversification opportunities of regions. Yeah, so it would be a challenge to work with other type of data, but of course they would provide very useful insights to get a more comprehensive picture. Absolutely.
My question is what, as we have seen during your presentation, most of the skills are more represented on the western part of Europe. So aren't we scared that if we focus too much on the sides of Europe and between France and Germany, for example, that if we invest, for example, the funds of the European New Deal for the hydrogen transition or whatever, aren't we scared that we might make the people actually have the skills from, for example, Eastern countries migrate to Western countries, which would create more inequalities on the Eastern side?
Yeah, I think your question is really about, okay, there are differences in Europe, right? So, and what we tend to see is that the strong capabilities are more concentrated in countries in Western Europe, right? And not so much in Eastern Europe, and also to a very limited extent in many South European regions, right? First of all, that's a fact. Right, so this is how it is, and therefore we believe that this type of transitions, that the regions that have those strongest capabilities will be the ones that will advance those transitions and will be the first movers. Now, of course, these are we use here pattern data, right? And so not many regions, for example, in Eastern Europe, actually patent a lot, right? So you don't really. So that I think is also kind. Sorry, there's also a kind of limitation of our research, because if you would have, for example, you could measure capabilities in industries, for example, in which you have you would fully capture the whole economy, and you would connect that. To green capabilities and digital capabilities, you might have a slightly different picture. Would probably also come back to the question of Cesar previously, because if you use industry data, you come closer to the implementation process, and you could say something on that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this is, when I introduced my talk, I said it's not about the inequality issue, right? Why lacking regions lag behind in that respect. But those data actually show that there is an issue there, right? So, there are some. Well, if you want to compete globally on those type of technologies, as we show in the World Bank, you might actually focus on those that have the strongest capabilities in order to compete with China in the near future. Right, so there are two questions here. One is global competition, and you have to concentrate all your investment and your resources in the best regions in Europe to compete with China. And the other end, we have a cohesion challenge in Europe, and we want to see also that Eastern Europe and Southern Europe catch up and participate in those transitions, and that requires another type of policy, right? But these are big questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron, for your presentation. I'm Michele Kiewicz from LEREPS. Quick question. So I work on rural areas, and I'm not too familiar with all the research on cities, but I was very interested by your graph connecting green technologies and digital technologies. I was wondering.
Yes. You want to see it, or? Well, this is
I don't know to phrase this question. So apparently there's oh no, not this one.
13.
Oh.
13. This
Yes.
one. Yes.
Yeah, okay. And so apparently there's a correlation between green technologies, digital technologies. And I was wondering, from the perspective of the end users, the inhabitants of these cities, would it be interesting to look at a potential correlation with the well-being of these inhabitants? Because behind the question is, do we need all these technologies? Do we need all this innovation for the well-being of inhabitants?
Yes. Okay. That's of course a good question, right? I mean, here we measure technological capabilities, right? We use patents, right? So I also mentioned that of course when this twin transition is going to be implemented, it depends on many other factors than just the technologies that are around. So in your case, what you're actually saying is that, and this there has been some studies on that already, is to what extent there is also social acceptance by citizens, right? And of course, when the social acceptance is much higher, the twin transition will go much faster. If the social acceptance is not there, there's not really support in that respect. Then, of course, those cities might lag behind because of that. But that's, of course, also an issue that is a social issue that needs to be discussed in those particular urban environments. But this is very much work in progress, right? We don't know too much about that. Certainly not at a global scale, comparing many cities in such big data sets.
Okay, I think we're going to move to the next presentation. So thank you, Ron. Okay, so 30 minutes approximately. I will make you a sign. For
Okay, and the microphone is here. So first of all, is this? Yeah, that's better. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's very
Merci.
all of you today to tell you a little bit about the work that we have been doing over a relatively long period of time, which I think is going to help explain some of the methods that Ron was using in his previous talk. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to walk you through an introduction of economic complexity methods, which are these methods that help us understand transitions like the double transition that Ron was discussing. So during the last decade, this idea of economic complexity has become quite popular. There are now thousands of reports, papers, and platforms that use this methodology to try to understand how economies change over time. But you might be wondering, well, what is economic complexity and why people are interested in using these methods? Why there is such a demand for these methods? And in simple terms, it's just the use of machine learning to understand questions of economic development. When we're looking at economic development, we're going to be looking at data that is relatively fine-grained, data on the activities that are present in locations, on the occupations that people perform, on the industries that might be present in a certain economy. And to understand that data with a good level of resolution, you need tools that are able to preserve the identity of the elements involved, and machine learning tools are very good at that. They're able to deal with fine-grained data, and that's why they have become so successful at things like generating language or processing images, because they have that added resolution that you don't find on aggregative methods, on those methods in which you add things out and therefore you lose the identity of the elements in the analysis. So that's why we use machine learning methods here. The reason why we use them is not just because we like them, is that one, they're agnostic about the sources of development, so they can help us identify features in a data set that might be features that we don't even hypothesize are there. Okay, that's really important. and they're also good at dealing with this fine-grained data, and this fine-grained data is important in understanding economic geography because of the non-fungibility of factors. Factors such as knowledge, for instance, are highly non-fungible. You cannot change a doctor for a pianist or a pianist for a baker. Knowledge is extremely specific and therefore is divided in this large infinite alphabet of components that are growing, that are recombining, and that are giving rise to these different economic activities. So that non-fungibility requires that you use methods that try to preserve the identity of the elements involved throughout the analysis. And that eventually what is going to give you is going to give you the opportunity to do custom analysis. You're going to have tools that you're going to deploy in data sets on patents, data sets on industries, data sets on occupations, data sets that have a resolution at the level of the city or at the level of the country. And these methods are going to be able to provide tailored recommendations for each one of these geographies, for each one of these activities, because the resolution, the identity of the elements involved was not lost in the analysis. We didn't add things up. So there's two main methods here. The first one is the idea of relatedness, and the second one is the idea of economic complexity, and I'm going to use the first part of my presentation to go through both of these methods. Later at the end, I'm going to use some of these methods to look a little bit at the economy of France and that of Haute-Garonne. So relatedness is simply the measure of the affinity between a location and an activity. How far is Toulouse from being good at the video game industry? Okay, it's a distance between a place, a geography, and a certain activity which might require a set of capacities, knowledge, infrastructure, capabilities that might be present in that location or not. And since we don't know what these capabilities are, we want to be agnostic about the factors, we want to use a method that is able to capture the presence of factors even if we don't know which factors are those. Economic complexity, it's a method that, unlike relatedness, is not trying to tell you which location is more affine to an activity, but it's trying to measure the knowledge intensity of an activity or the knowledge intensity of a location. It's a way to try to reduce now the dimensionality of this matrix, is not aggregate, but reduce the dimensionality in such a way that we get a metric that tells us the sophistication of an economy or of an activity, and these metrics have been shown to help predict economic growth, inequality, and emissions. So they're helping us understand why some economies do better in terms of growth, but also in generating growth that is more inclusive and more green. So relatedness measures the affinity between a location and an activity, a city, and an industry, for instance. And the way that it works is more or less the following. So here you have a network in which each node represents a product, and products are connected if they're likely to be co-exported. So here we created one of these networks using trade data. And this is old news. This is from 2007. Okay? And nodes being products are going to be things like frozen fish or crustaceans and mollusks or vegetables or fruit or vegetable juices. And the links connect products that tend to be co-exported by the same countries, and that is a signal that, well, if the countries that are good at export fish are also good at exporting frozen fish, maybe there's some connection between those two activities in terms of the knowledge that they require. Now, you see, some products are colored, they're blue, they're yellow, and some are grayed out. The ones that are colored are the ones that Chile exported in 1979, and the ones that are grayed out are the ones that Chile did not. So you have the world of all products, you have all possible activities, but within all those possible activities, there's a pattern of specialization that is represented by those color nodes that form clusters. So Chile is in that cluster up there in the top left, which is a blue cluster of seafood and fish, the yellow cluster that involves processed foods and so forth. Now, the prediction here would be that we can use this map to assess what are the latent capabilities. So we know what they're good at, we know what Chile is good at in 1979, but we could hypothesize that maybe fresh fish is something that even though Chile does not export with comparative advantage at that time, they could, because it's connected to our products that they do export. So that measure of how surrounded is a node that is inactive, but nodes that are already active, is that metric of relatedness that Ron was discussing in his presentation. And that measure of latent capacity can be mapped throughout the network to predict what are the activities that a location is likely to enter in the future. So if we go from 1979 to 1996, you're going to see that Chile did develop comparative advantage in fresh fish and a bunch of other products. Therefore, validates this idea that development is not a random process. Activities are not just popping up here or there, but they're growing in a process of diffusion in which the complementarities of knowledge are important, and those knowledge complementarities give rise both to the structure of this network and the subsequent pattern of diversification that unfolds constrained by the structure of this network. Now, when we started talking about this in 2006, 2007, we used to explain this using an analogy, and I find the analogy is quite interesting because it helps you generate a mental picture on what is going on here. And the idea is that we can think of an economy as a forest. So each one of these products is a tree, you know, like, so we're going to think that each one of these products is a tree that can provide certain fruit, that can provide certain a good that has certain value. And in this word that the economies are forest, well, countries, you know, are made of collections of monkeys or firms that live in this forest and that live from this fruit. And since each one of these trees is a specific type of, you know, fruit or product, the process of development is the process by which these monkeys are jumping from tree to tree by going from one type of fruit to the next. So what we were seeing in Chile is kind of like this process in which we have this network, you know, that represents the structure of this forest or this product space, and we're seeing as this comparative advantage unfolds, you know, the jumping of these monkeys, the jumping of these firms that are moving now into new activities that are able to collect new types of fruit. Now, this idea of relatedness was first formalized using trade data. But actually, it's not about trade, and what happened during the last decade is that there was a lot of work that helped generalize, you know, this beyond trade. So, for example, here you have a space of industries. Here, each node represents an industry. They tend to be connected. They manufacture products in the same plants. Here you have a network of research. Here, each node is a research field, and they tend to be connected if the people that publish in a field also publish in another field. So it's a different type of connection, but also a connection that is indicative of some shared knowledge. If statisticians can publish in epidemiology, maybe that tells us that those two fields are related. Here you have a space of technologies from Ron and Pierre, in which technologies are connected if they tend to co-occur in the same patterns. You know? And the result of all of this and other papers was that we were in the presence not of a regularity or a curiosity, but of a principle that has been observed to operate for multiple types of economic activities and across a variety of scales. So this is like a law of economic geography that tells you that the probability that a location would enter or exit an activity increases with the number of related activities present in a location. Now, more recently, people have tried to unpack relatedness, okay? We can measure similarity between products because maybe they're co-exported by countries, or research fields because scholars tend to publish in both of them, but are there channels that we could try to tease or unpack? And one example is this paper that we did a few years ago with Cristian Jara Figueroa, in which we looked at data for the entire formal sector economy of Brazil. So this is a data set in which every social security contribution of the country is recorded, and we had yearly access to that data set, so we would know, for instance, that in the year 2005, there was a person working on a certain city, on a certain firm, on a certain establishment that operated in a certain industry, performing a certain occupation and receiving a certain wage. And we would know also how old that person was, what level of education they had, and whatnot. And we could trace people across time. So now we could see that someone was working as a concierge in a hotel in 2005 in Rio de Janeiro. And maybe in 2006, that person now was working in Sao Paulo as a salesperson in, you know, a tire distributor. So we could see those transitions. We could see how knowledge was moving as workers move from firm to firm. And the idea is that that employment history is the history of the knowledge of those workers. So I know what you know, not because you tell me. I know what you know because I've seen what you've done. So if there's a person that has worked for several years as a nurse in a hospital, I know that they know about the hospital industry, and I know they know about nursing, maybe not about hospital administration. You know, there's occupation-specific knowledge, industry-specific knowledge, and location-specific knowledge. Maybe you work in a hospital in Manaus, and a hospital in Manaus might be very different than a hospital in Porto Alegre, you know, and you might want to have also access to that regional knowledge. So we have now, with this data set, the ability to unpack relatedness. And we looked at certain outcomes, and one of them was the success of pioneer firms. So before we were talking about diversification, We were talking, for example, about Chile going from frozen fish to fresh fish. But when you go into a new activity and you're looking at it using the course data that we used before, you are seeing like a big jump. You're seeing that a country went from not having a specialization in activity to becoming a specialized. That means tons of exports or lots of employment. Here we're looking at the atoms of diversification, like the first firm to operate in an industry that was not present in a location. So let's say that in Porto Alegre, we never observed any firm operating in the video game industry. And then all of a sudden, in a certain year in our data set, we observed that firm. We now can go back and see who they hired and where these people were working last year. And we can see what knowledge they brought in. Did they bring knowledge that was specific to that industry or not? Did they brought knowledge that was specific to the occupation that they were performing or not? You know, did they come from a different location or did they have knowledge about the same place? And because we have the concept of relatedness, we can do this in a continuum. So here you see a histogram of the number of firms that hire a certain number of people with a level of industry-specific knowledge and occupation-specific knowledge. And what you see is that the left of the chart is kind of empty. There's not a lot of dots on the left of the chart. The histogram is not very much occupied because a lot of these pioneer firms did not hire people with industry-specific knowledge. They hired people with industry and specific knowledge, meaning that these people used to work on an industry that was very different, okay? And they hired people that had occupation and specific knowledge, and also on the top, occupation-specific knowledge. So in some sense, the entrepreneurs didn't seem to prioritize that much that industry-specific knowledge. They were going into this new space with people that sometimes have done the same occupation, but not in the same industry. Now the next chart is going to show which companies survive, okay? These are the decisions that were made. It's a histogram of sample, but the next one is about the survival. And you're going to see that it's quite different. Now, when we look at the companies that survive, all of the mass is on the left. The only thing that seems to matter is that industry-specific knowledge. That occupation-specific knowledge, which is the vertical variation, seems to be rather small. And when we bring this, you know, into like a regression format, when we're trying to predict survival, when we're trying to predict the growth of these firms, now we find that industry-specific knowledge is robust, significant. It survives a number of controls, industry fixed effects, region fixed effects, and so forth. Occupation-specific knowledge doesn't seem to matter. You know, years of schooling doesn't go to the dance either. And local knowledge seems to help explain survival, but not growth, meaning that firms that hire more local people tend to survive a little bit more, but not necessarily grow faster. You know, and the ones that have industry-specific knowledge do survive more and also do grow faster. So you can unpack relatedness and you can start getting ideas about which aspects of this similarity are the ones that matter. In this case, the idea that it's industry-specific knowledge is important because if you think about it, we have an educational system that is very much geared towards occupations, but after people transition from the university into the real world, you get stuck on the industry. If you have been working on the film industry for many years, you're not going to become a lawyer the next year. Huh? Like you get stuck on the industries that you're in, you know, because that industry-specific knowledge, those networks are really important and determinant, and they seem to help explain the survival of entrepreneurial activities across Brazil. Now you can unpack also relatedness in the context of trade data. Before we were using employment data, but when it comes to trade, when I show you those slides for Chile, I show you slides in which Chile was entering a new activity, but when a country enters a new activity through exports, they have to enter a new activity by exporting that to some destination. So, for instance, you know, when Georgia starts exporting wine, well, they have to export the wine to someone. You know, it is to Malaysia, is it to the United States? Can we unpack relatedness also in that bilateral world? And we can. You know, the only thing is that instead of having a single value of relatedness, when we go into the bilateral realm, we're going to have to divide it into three, because now we can have a country that is, for example, like Korea, exporting a new similar product to the same destination. So in this example, Korea was exporting product 1 and product 2 to Chile, and then there is product 3 that is similar to product 1 and product 2, so they enter with that. Korea was exporting dishwashers, refrigerators, and now they start exporting dryers to Chile. So it's a product relatedness to the same destination. but it could be an importer relatedness story. You could say, well, you know, Korea is exporting refrigerators to Peru and to Argentina, and you know what, Chile is very close to Peru and Argentina, so maybe if you know how to export to Chile neighbors, you might be able to learn how to export to Chile. So it's now the distance between where you're exporting that product to and the target that you're trying to get. And finally, we have exporter relatedness. Maybe Chile was importing this product from Japan, China. Maybe then Korea could absorb that knowledge from its neighbors and start exporting the same activity to Chile. And when you put all of those three relatedness on a big gravity model, you find that they're all highly significant. You know? So you create like a big model that tries to predict future exports now at the bilateral level, like how much a country is going to export of a product to a certain destination, and you get something that is quite interesting because you get to expand, you know, these gravity models, you know, to incorporate information about the knowledge that is specific to the product and to the geographies that is unavailable in the other variables of extended gravity models. So you can think that you're predicting the future here using inertial terms. The easiest way to predict the exports in the future is to say that they're the same as the exports today. But you have to beat that if you're going to have something that is predictive. You know? So you have other terms that are interpretable. Maybe distance matters. Maybe the GDP of the countries matter. Maybe if they share a border, if they have a colonial history, if they share a language. Those things matter. And that's the idea of extended gravity. And those will be those terms that are interpretable, but you cannot move them so much. You cannot change the distance between two countries or whether they had a colonial history or not. Those things, if they move slowly. You might have a faster plane at some point that shrinks distance, but for the most part, they're not very movable. And then now, with this idea of relating, you have these structural terms, these terms that capture information that is specific to the activity, that is specific to the destination, and they tend to be some of the most predictive terms in the model. They really push that predictive power up, you know, and they're highly significant. So it tells you that there's a lot that is not being captured if you don't have the use of these techniques to create these activity-specific features. Now, I'm going to switch gears to talk not about relatedness, but to talk about economic complexity. This is not about how you enter a new activity, or how you enter with a new activity into a new destination, but how you reduce the dimensionality of these large matrices to create indicators that help us understand their potential for growth, inequality, and emissions. So going back to our forest analogies, we're going to be asking now not which are the closest trees, but what are the most valuable trees in this forest. You know? And the way that you do this is quite simple. There are many ways to explain this idea, but today I'm going to use this one, which is to say that, look, we're going to assume that these capabilities, we're going to call them knowledge, you know, are specific to location and specific to activities, and we want to quantify them. So we're going to say that the knowledge K of location C is a function of which activities are present in that location, that is MCP, and a function of how sophisticated those activities are. So basically the first equation there is saying, look, Boston is sophisticated, like the knowledge of Boston is large, if the activities that are present in Boston are sophisticated. So it's super simple, yes? It's tautological almost, yeah? Now, the second equation says which activities are sophisticated. So it says an activity is sophisticated if it's present in places that are sophisticated. So I'm saying pharma is a sophisticated activity if it's located in sophisticated cities. So I have a circular argument, yes? I'm defining, you know, the sophistication of an activity based on the locations and the sophistication of a location based on those activities. I can put the second equation in the first one, you know, and then basically I get a self-consistent equation that when I linearize it, it gives me an eigenvalue problem. Now, I can take a very simple assumption, which I would say is the most neutral, simple assumption, which is to say these things are average. And you want to say that these things are average because you're going to say that a team gets better when the new player in the team is a little bit better than the other players on the team, you know? So not everything adds. To add, you have to improve. And if you make that average assumption, you know, you say basically that the sophistication of the economy of Boston increases if the new industries that enter, you know, increase, then, you know, you get to this form, you deduce the shape of that matrix that when you diagonalize can get the economic complexity. Now, Applying this to the data, though, is not that easy because the units of observation are actually not comparable. So when you are working with data on the geography of economic activities, you're going to have big units. You have big cities like Tokyo or Seoul. You know, you're going to have also small cities. You know, you're going to have big countries like China and the United States, or small countries like Macedonia. And when you're doing math, math doesn't know that row number 1 represents something that is big and row number 7 represents something that is small. Rows are rows, and math operates over, you know, those matrices in a way that it's indistinguishable from, you know, what they represent in the real world. So to get these techniques to work, you cannot simply apply them willy-nilly over economic data. There's a sequence of careful normalizations that you need to realize so that the units of observation become comparable. So you grab, for instance, the data from exports and you calculate a specialization, and then you have to denoise the specialization matrix to make it binary, to remove also noise that comes from relatively small units. And eventually, the formula that I showed you before, that ECI formula that comes from that circular argument, is the eigenvectors of that square matrix is a matrix of similarity between geographies. And that is a good property too, because we're saying, look, you know, we want similar geographies to have similar values. If you produce the same than this other geography, you have to have a similar value for your complexity. Now, how does the complexity of the world looks and how it has been changing over time? So let's now bring the data to the model. And in the year 2000, it was a world that was dominated by Japan, the United States, and Western Europe. So the ranking is Japan, Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, US, UK. France was number 10. And when you start going forward in time, you know, 20 years to year 2020, what happened is that a lot of economies from East Asia, and particularly Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea, moved up this ranking, and they have displaced, you know, Western Europe in these rankings of economic sophistication. So now France is no longer in the top 10. Now France is there in number 15. Again, this is not a story about trade. So here we have economic complexity for US cities. These are metropolitan statistical areas, using data on patents and using data on payroll by industry. Using data on patents and payroll by industry, we find San Jose or Silicon Valley to be the number 1, the most complex economy in the country. And when we look at payroll by industry, we get San Jose, we get San Francisco, we get Boston, we get LA, we get Seattle, we get a pretty good ranking of cities, you know, that are sophisticated, but not necessarily the largest cities in the country. When we look at patents, we do that even better, because one of the things that is good about this technique is that it is able to control for those size effects. So we get San Jose, Silicon Valley, which is relatively large, it's in the Bay Area. Then you get Austin, which is not that large. You know, then you get San Francisco, which is large again, but then you get Boise City, you know, Boise in Idaho. Why would Boise be so sophisticated on technology? And the reason is that Boise is where Micron is located. It's actually a very high-tech city. And Micron is the only manufacturer in the US that knows how to produce RAM memory. If it wasn't for Micron, the US would have to import all of its computer memory. You know? In Rochester, Minneapolis, you have 3M, which is a very important material science company. So you can capture that information. And for instance, you see large cities like Chicago, they don't rise to the top. It's not a size ranking. It's not about economies being large. It's really about having that sophistication. Now here you have economic complexity in the UK. This is from a report by Penny Milley and Diane Coyle. Here you have economic complexity in China. This is using data on publicly listed firms. So this is very biased and complete data. These are only the firms that are available in the stock market, you know, in China. And nevertheless, you recover like that coastal pattern very well, with Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen being, you know, the most sophisticated economies in China. Here you have Mexican states. Mexico is a very interesting case because it's a country that is highly uneven in terms of its economic capacity. So the north of Mexico, you have places like Nuevo León, where the city of Monterrey is located. They have high complexity compared, you know, to sophisticated economies in the world. But on the bottom, you have states like Guerrero, you know, that have very low complexity, and actually, you know, they're in a difficult economic situation. On the left, you have an estimate from the Central Bank of Mexico. On the right, you know, the one that you can find in datamexico.org. And the reason why people care about economic complexity is because it's a fundamental that helps you explain other values, other things that we care about. Okay, so like for example, in stocks, people talk about fundamentals, how much money is the company earning as a way to say, well, what should the stock value be in the future? Economic complexity tells you something about the capacity that the economy has to produce a diversity of sophisticated goods that explains these other macroeconomic outcomes. So one of them is that it helps explain economic growth. And my favorite example, because there's a lot of examples by now that have validated this over and over again using different controls, different ways to try to get closer to causality. But to me, my favorite example is this work by Giacomo Domini. He's an economic historian from Italy, that he grabbed data from the Paris Expos from the 19th century. And he reasoned that the Paris Expos in the 19th century were expos in which countries would come to show the products that they wanted to export. Yes, they were there to find trade partners. And he reconstructed, therefore, the international trade matrices of countries in the 19th century using that Paris Expo data. And then he used that to calculate the economic complexity index of the world in the 19th century. And he finds that that economic complexity index explains quite a lot of the variance of economic growth during the 20th century in a regression that has 96 observations and country-fixed effects. Therefore, you have like almost no degrees of freedom. It's like really hard to get stars when you have 96 data points, 33 countries and country-fixed effects. And nevertheless, he finds kind of like a very strong, more significant than the solo term component for economic complexity using data from this Paris Expo. And you can say that there is not so much endogeneity here. He's looking at this 19th century data from the Expo, looking at growth in a century later. Economic complexity also explains variations in inequality and in greenhouse gas emission intensity. So as economies grow and they diversify, they emit more, but they emit less per unit of GDP. And that's something that is important, because at the end of the day, we want the world to be greener, but we need to acknowledge that not everywhere people are living in the conditions that we live here in the south of France. There are parts of the world that need a lot of economic growth to get to good livable conditions. Now the good news about this is that as economies develop, the intensity of emissions decreases because we move into activities that generate more value with less use of energy than when we are at activities that are more extractive, that require lots of energy to generate a single unit of GDP. And more recently, where this has been moving is to try to now go beyond single data sets, similar to what we did in relatedness. This is work from Viktor Stoikovsky and Philippe Koch here at the Center for Collective Learning, in which we grab data on trade, technology, and research to create a multidimensional measure of economic complexity that helps balance the limitations of trade data. So for instance, in trade data, a country like Mexico does very well because they're integrated to the value chain of the United States, and a country like Australia does very poorly because they export raw materials to China because they're far from global markets. But when we incorporate data on technology through patents or research using papers, we correct for that, and we can create more holistic rankings that actually are better at predicting growth, inequality, and emissions. Here we can see France. There's not a lot of variation in France, in this set of calculations, 13 on trade, 17 on technology, and 16 on research. And how do we bring these ideas to practice? And this is my last set of slides. Basically, one of the things that I learned many years ago is that if you want to help people understand what you want to say, you cannot simply give them a message. You have to put in their hands a tool that they can use to discover that message for themselves. So when I started my group at MIT in 2010, we started creating these tools. And in 2011, we released the Observatory of Economic Complexity. This is today the most popular tool to visualize international trade data in the world. Then we were invited by the government of Minas Gerais in Brazil, and we built a platform that integrated trade data, industry data, and education data for all of Brazil. And we continue, with Pantheon, for instance, is one that looks at data on cultural exports. Data USA, which was created by Deloitte, together with Deloitte, that looks at data now not only on the economy, but geographies, education, healthcare, and whatnot. Data Africa, jobs KSA, and we keep on going, eventually until we get to data Mexico, and I think now I got a beach ball, yeah, and to the OEC, so we can be able to see France. So with these tools, we can now start exploring, the French economy. So we have data for France on the OEC. So let's take a quick look at France and at Haute-Garonne. So these are France quarterly exports. This is official data that is published by the government. We don't change the data. We just visualize it and distribute it. And you see, of course, the COVID down. You see in the fourth quarter of 2021, the recovery to a little bit higher than pre-COVID levels. And these are France exports and destinations. So it's an economy that is quite diverse. Medicine is a big part. You see that on the top. Cars, planes here on the bottom. And it's an economy that is quite centered on trade with Europe. Exports to Germany, Italy, and Belgium. Now it's an economy that is interestingly a little bit dual, in that when we put it in a diagram in which we have relatedness and complexity, we see that on the top, there's a lot of related products that are of high sophistication. So there's all of this mechanical engineering sector, which is very important in France. The car sector, transmissions, car parts, so forth. There's also the chemical sector that has also been very important in France, whether it is for agro or whether it is for cosmetics and whatnot. And on the bottom, there are like lower complexity activities in which is actually the agricultural products, like the corn, the sunflower, and whatnot. Now when we do a regional split of France exports, you see that the #1 exporter of France, at least on the last quarter of 2021, was the province of Haute-Garonne. Haute-Garonne, okay? So actually, was the #1 exporter of France on the last quarter of 2021. And what does Haute-Garonne export? Well, one thing, yeah. Exactly, and where do they export? To China, to India, to the UK. But, is it all value added here, or no? Actually, when you look at Haute-Garonne's imports, Haute-Garonne imports a lot of aircraft. Like 57% of Haute-Garonne's imports are also aircraft, meaning that, of course, those exports that we see here, are because Haute-Garonne is part of a value chain in which they're importing aircraft, but also a lot of aircraft parts and so forth. So there is a net, trade, of course, that is positive, but not all of that is value added. And a lot of that other value added, where is it coming from? From Germany, there's a lot of that value added that actually is coming from Germany as parts that then, get included into the economy. And it's an interesting sector, because aircraft is, on the one hand, a sophisticated sector. When you measure the complexity of aircraft, if high complexity is way above average. But it's not a central sector in the product space. Most other high complexity activities tend to be central in the product space, meaning that they live in clusters with lots of related activities. But aircraft, it's there on a little branch together with explosive ammunition and tanks and armored vehicles. It's like a highly related sector to defense, of course, and that creates an interesting innovation ecosystem challenge, because it creates an innovation ecosystem that on the one hand has a high sophisticated activity, but on the other hand lacks that relatedness. So to summarize it using the analogy that we presented before, the economy of Haute-Garonne would be a little bit more kind of like that situation, in which is high complexity, but it's relatively isolated, and that might lock it in the case that the world changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Cesar. If you have questions, comments, we have some time before the break.
Thank you for the question. So I was the guy presenting the environmental footprint of digital stuff, and I'm wondering, well, you've presented that when the economical complexity increases, then the emissions of greenhouse gas, they tend to decrease with respect to the GDP. But the point is that we have to decrease very quickly and with a tremendous measure the greenhouse gas effect. So do you think that we should continue to increase economical complexity, because there is a limit, and that the idea of decoupling between emission and GDP. So shall we really increase economical complexity, or shall we look for alternative solution where economical complexity decrease? I'm an engineer as a background, yeah. And I'm very interested in what we call low-tech solutions that are very sober technical solutions that also tend to make possible sustainable lifestyles, to change value, cultures, imaginaries, and lifestyle to be sustainable. So is really economical complexity a good indicator for GDP, for sure, but for what should be the transition, I am doubtful about that.
So that decoupling happens at high complexity because you have to separate. Complexity is not an aggregate variable, it's a variable about structure. So reducing complexity would not necessarily, for instance, mean reducing emissions. It could increase emissions because it would mean we're not going to be involved in sectors that are high GDP and low emissions. We might going to be involved in sectors, that are extractive, like mineral, and that's, for instance, what you would require to reduce complexity. So to reduce complexity it would require to move into sectors that have a larger footprint because it's not a measure of volume, it's a measure of structure. So in that case, that decoupling that we are observing, it's happening because at the highest levels of complexity of the economy, you can generate a ton of GDP, a ton of value added with very little energy. Like when in a video game, if a video game sells many, many copies, yes, sure, there is cost in the servers, there is everything, but compared to generating 200 million in revenue when it comes to oil, and you have to move it around the world, the amount of emissions that you would need to generate the same 200 million is much larger in the low complexity economy. So that decoupling is moving in that direction.
Just to precise, maybe there's a question very quickly. So you showed us how to increase less emissions.
Yes.
Our goal now is to decrease emission. How do we make it?
I don't know. Do you know?
I think by producing less and producing less complex.
No, so for instance, I would disagree. I think that if we focus on changing the parts, we're always going to be at marginal improvement. So this, green technology, it's a subsidy for like the green electric vehicle. I don't buy it. I think that, for example, if we want to really reduce emissions in cities, we have to make them more bicycle friendly, and that's an architectural change, not a component change. So I think we have a lot of these component changes now in our policy that are actually subsidies for sectors, that are actually quite energy intensive. To produce a Tesla truck, you require a lot of emissions. To produce a bicycle that is electric, and I've done more than 3,000 kilometers this year on my electric bike, you need way less emissions, but I don't see policy moving in that direction of structural changes that are moving more into kind of like trying to reduce the emissions of the same pieces that they have, when maybe the bigger changes are to change the structure of how things are connected, for instance, by going really into electromobility, which is not what these green deals are doing. These green deals are automotive deals. Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. I really appreciate it. I have two questions for you, if you don't mind. So the first one is related to your work, related to those Brazilian workers moving from different companies. I just cannot even grasp the amount of data in the background. It must be quite impressive. But the question I have for you is this. For some reason, you seem to have left out the type of education those people get. And I would be very curious to get a sense of whether you choose engineering or, let's say, accounting, that might eventually give you a chance, one education versus the other, to either have a path where you're stuck for your life in one company versus one where flexibility is actually part of what you're learning. That's, I don't know if the data were there in the first place, but I'm very curious as to, the education choice you make. And that,
we didn't have data on the degrees, or we knew that they had, let's say, an undergraduate education or a master's education, but we didn't know if that master was in the University of Pernambuco on pharmacology or, in philosophy. That we didn't know. And of course, it's data that would be, in principle, as a control, you can use dummies and control for it. In practice, if you want to now start looking at the effects, you might want to get a little bit more creative, because there might be also relatedness in that structure. Like the structure is not infinitely granular, but something that you want to capture. But that's some of the things that I think, for example, Melanie, who is now in the group, has been working now with data on the choices that people make to go into college and using data sets that she have access to. And they're one of the things that maybe we're going to be able to explore in the future if you have that transition. Unfortunately, what I've learned is that the data sets of workers and the data sets of education are usually not provided in a link form. So you can get that data set on education, or you can get a data set on the work history, but linking those two, because administratively they're in different ministries that manage differently, that link, usually is hard to make, or I haven't been able to find it made somewhere. Yeah.
Very good, very good.
Yeah.
The second question, if you allow me, is related more to what you covered in a later part, that economic complexity and the global value chain, basically. I wanted to get your views with respect to what extent you think that the future is all about resilience in that global supply chain. We've had some serious cases over the last years, COVID, war in Ukraine, and I'm wondering if you do feel that resilience might actually mean our supply chain becomes a little bit less international, less complex. Just to give you an example, 3 days ago, President Biden was actually in Arizona because they're about to open a microchip plant so that a lot of the computers now in the US will be powered by those microchips coming from the US as opposed to having them coming from somewhere in Asia. So are we looking at less complexity for the years to come so that there is eventually more resilience? What do you think?
I don't think reshoring reduces complexity, but I think reshoring is strategic, in a world in which you have changing alliances, you have disruptions, and you might have inputs that are critical to many other industries. So I know for a fact that, like, also here in France, I have a friend, that works on Onera, that he works on this fluid dynamics model that he knows for a fact is worse than the commercially available application, but the government subsidizes that work because they want to keep that capacity strategically as something that people in the country know how to do. So there are these strategic considerations, which of course they're often geopolitical. It's kind of like I'll give you another example. In the 1920s and 1930s, Ford tried to create a city in the Amazons, actually a country, that the Brazilians would call Fordlandia, in the Tapajos River, because they knew that they depended on rubber that was produced in Indonesia, and that if the Japanese invaded Indonesia, they weren't going to have no rubber for the tires, for the jeeps, and for the planes, and for all of those applications. So those strategic considerations, I do think that they're important, and maybe the world got a little bit too happy with just-in-time manufacturing. When I visit a lot of manufacturers in my life, and many businesses that you would think that are about doing something, at the end, they're logistic business. Like a company like IKEA, their advantage is not design or wood, is packing and logistics, and that's where a lot of the margins went in the last 15, 20 years. And that generated networks that were very efficient, but were brittle. And with COVID, with what's happening in Ukraine, that brittleness has been exposed, because when you adapt too much, you lose evolvability. That's a well-known trade-off of complex systems, and that adaptability came in good times, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, where there were no such disruptions, and they could hyper-optimize those networks at the detriment of their resilience.
Okay, thank you, Cesar. So we will continue the discussion over coffee, okay?
Transition to be a dad and pick up my daughter from school.
Okay. Donc, on peut... Ah, il n'y a pas café. D'accord, ok. Bon, donc, c'est pas ce qu'on m'a dit. Un peu, 45. Ok. On peut prendre un petit pause et on revient.
Okay, so there's going to be a break for half an hour, and we're back at 4:45. Thank you very much. Thank you. Palmer.
30 minutes.
30 minutes, and I will, yeah. Yeah, and then we have 50 minutes for questions.
But I'm going to be concise. I know we're like monstrously over time.
No,
we are good. Okay. I tend to talk really loud, and when I talk with a microphone, I speak insanely loud. So I may at some point drop this. Hi, I'm Erica Palmer. I'm from Cornell. I am a systems engineer. Just to show of hands, does anybody know what systems engineering is? Okay, well, you don't count. What is it? Don't worry, I'm not going to call on you for an explanation. Okay, so systems engineering, the quick and dirty, is there are many different types of engineering, right? Mechanical. There's a lot of aerospace engineering here, obviously, in Toulouse. I have good friends at Airbus. There are all the different types of engineering that you have, and then what sits on top of it, going across all those different domains, is systems engineering. So we have our feet in a lot of different applications of engineering. And we've been talking about a lot of different engineering domains today. I just had a conversation about food. That was one I hadn't heard actually presented, but we're talking a lot about, for example, energy and different types of technology that were presented throughout all the talks. But one part of engineering that also goes across the top, in addition to systems, is the environment. And so we're hearing then, obviously, a lot of the technologies have different environmental footprints. And there's a lot of talk about geography today. So I'm changing a little bit what I was planning to talk about today, based on the talks that came before. That's kind of the privilege of coming later in the program. And so a lot of different places, a lot of networks, a lot of things connected to each other. And that is really important, and what I'm about to say does not discount that importance at all. But another dimension that needs to be considered, that I've heard less of, except for not you, Olivier, but the Olivier who is sitting there, is time, and specifically life cycle perspectives. When you're looking at the structure of anything, things being connected to things, you're looking at a snapshot in one point in time. Those connections and what's involved in those networks are dynamic. New things are coming in, things are leaving, and the relationships between them are changing constantly. And that is a really, really important thing to remember when you are developing policies that manipulate those systems. So, that's briefly what I'm going to be discussing. I just want to give a little bit of background about myself first. I'm a systems engineer, but I also have a background in environmental engineering, but I have applied this to social policy. I know that seems like a bit of a strange leap, and those that I worked with during my PhD also thought that. So if you're working on a PhD, it's good to do strange things. But what I do is I take systems engineering methods and apply them in the social sciences, and I do the opposite. I bring the social sciences in to systems engineering processes. And what I mean by systems engineering specifically here, because it's many things, is that we are looking at how different elements are connected to each other and how that changes over time. And I'm doing this specifically for social systems. And I know, for those of you that don't have a systems background, I'm going to go over a little bit about what I mean by that. So I teach this at Cornell. I teach socio-technical systems and policy. And I also teach this from a circular economy perspective. It may seem a little strange to have an engineer here. Olivier he is an engineer, but I don't know if there's any other engineers here, but I was also assumed when I came here by Ron, you were like, oh, so you're in economics, and I'm like, actually, no, I'm an engineer. I'm the weirdo in the room, but that's okay, because I'm used to being the weirdo in the room. So I have a lab at Cornell. It's called the Systems and Society Research Lab. And what we do there is we build policy simulators through living labs. Now, if you work in European research communities, living labs is a bit of a buzzword right now, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. Right. So socio-technical systems. When you're talking about twin transitions, you're talking about, now I'm specifically talking about time. Okay, we have the systems engineering life cycle over on the side there. So when you're talking about twin transitions, in the digital and the green transition, you're talking about emergence on one side, and you're talking about impact on another. On the bottom of this, you're seeing different social systems that have to come together at the beginning of this life cycle to engineer something. They're developing some new product or developing or changing and adapting some existing industry. Through the life cycle of that, it's not just one point in time. Those products have an impact on the environment, and it's not just climate change. When we're talking about digital technology, very often we're talking about terrestrial ecotoxicity, for example, is one category. There are many different environmental impact categories, and where that technology hurts that impact category changes depending on what part of the life cycle we're talking about. And so we were talking a little bit about, well, it takes massive amounts of energy to use these devices, for example. So the use of the device is very heavy when it comes to, for example, impact for climate change or global warming potential is actually what it's called in life cycle analysis, which is what this is based on. But when I spoke a moment ago about, for example, terrestrial ecotoxicity, so poisoning the land, that happens a lot during the beginning because of mineral extraction. So you can't just look at different products and say they are good or they are bad for the environment. What you can say is that they have different impacts in different places at different times. And that also varies by geography. Not only where these are being produced, these impacts, but who is being affected at what points in time. So, sustainability versus green. So I know we're always saying the Green New Deal, and we tend to use sustainability and green interchangeably. But if you look at, for example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, you'll notice that a lot of them don't specifically have to do with the environment, but they are very tied to it. It's very difficult to decouple social and environmental goals. And so whenever we're talking about a green transition, we're not just talking about lowering impacts for particular environmental impact categories, we're also looking at different social effects in different parts of that life cycle. And so for example, where is all this e-waste going once it gets to the end of its life? Very often it's not being recycled and it's poisoning different places in landfills. Where are all these minerals being extracted from? I can tell you they're usually from countries where they have a lot of issues that are going on socially, and in addition to the health effects of mineral extraction. So what we do with systems engineering for socio-technical systems is we try to develop ways to make this better, to boil it down very simply. And we find ways to make this better technically through different ways of using technology, but we also do this through policy and the development of policy throughout the life cycle. And we do so a lot of policy analysis, for example, but what we do is we bring the community in to do this. So my argument is always any piece of technology, even what they're doing at Airbus, I always like to pick on my Airbus friends, is socio-technical. All pieces of technology need to be developed by people, by the social systems that we're seeing in the bottom of this. Every piece of technology comes from people. Robots so far are not developing technology, and even if they were, we would be developing the robots. And in addition, all those products that are created have an effect in some way for society. not just in terms of its impact, its social impact, its environmental impact, but we're making it for a reason. The fundamental tenet of engineering is design. We are designing something to transform the world in some way. It's that transformative nature. So we were actually discussing at the lunch today before before the event about the empirical nature of what we're doing. And I didn't get this far in our conversation, but we actually aren't really so concerned about that because we're not asking why questions when we do this. We're also not asking what questions. We're asking how questions. We want to transform, based on what we know and assuming things like causality, everything that, for example, a policy decision maker needs to take into account to then transform the world in some way, how can we build better tools for them to do that? And that's what we're building in socio-technical systems engineering. And when we talk about policy in socio-technical systems, we're looking at its systemic innovation potential. And what that means is that you'll see a lot of different both technologies and policies. I saw some technologies that were listed today that are very low in what we call systemic innovation potential. For example, carbon capture and storage. Terrible when it comes to this. The reason for that is we don't actually have to change who we are as a society to actually produce the desired behavior goal, which is to reduce CO2 equivalent emissions, right? If you want a policy or a technology to be implemented in a way that allows the system to have emergent desirable behavior, it needs to be high in systemic innovation potential. And those are the types of policies and technologies that we're trying to build. And to build this, we start with a particular problem and we model backwards from there. So for example, if we are trying to specifically look at climate change, so we're looking at either atmospheric CO2 equivalents or the CO2 equivalent emissions rising over time. What we would then do from there is then with a digital answer and with an environmental policy answer, how do we work those together in order to get that behavior to go down in a way that the system allows that behavior to be produced without forcing it to? Now you can make the argument that we're forcing it to do that by implementing a policy itself. But very often when you make small, very small social system changes, you're not doing much force. You're creating a shared vision with stakeholders who already want this behavior to happen. They just need to find better ways in which to do it. And so this is what we do with Living Labs, is we create this shared vision to fix that problem, and we build policy development tools. And this in no way supplants any other kind of economic tools that are out there. This is complementary. And I'm not just saying that because I'm talking to an economist audience. I must say that I have talked to economist audiences before, and I have, let's just say I've died on the hill a couple of times, so this is definitely a bit more refined than it used to be. But it is very true when I'm saying that. We're here to work together to both come to a common goal, and we have different tools that can help each other get there. Obviously, I take everything from a systems perspective, but when you start dissecting policy and evaluating it from a life cycle perspective, you'll see that there are a lot more opportunities for policy to have not only successful implementation, but much higher impact. And so when you're dissecting it across this life cycle, and so what's presented up here are, you can design life cycle stages in any way. This is in no way, written in stone. But as an example, of time, concept design, development, testing, operations, and end of life. A policy has all of those things too. Policies, for instance, at end of life, it can either die and not work at all and then it never does anything, or it, for instance, can be adapted, improved, and evolve. So this way, these stages are not sequential, but they're iterative and can sometimes work in other sequences. And so very often because I did my PhD, actually, it's in systems engineering and social policy, but I wound up housed with a bunch of political scientists, and they very much hated everything that I did, by the way. So it's very good to be in a room with people who disagree with you because it makes you really question what it is that you're doing. But when we did find common ground, one of the things that we would discuss was this policy life cycle, and they would say, well, very often what we do when we develop policy is that we stop at the idea. We stop right at the beginning, and we stop testing, for example, not just that, oh, it's going to be successful and implemented in this like perfect world, but going further from that and testing out different scenarios because society is very complex, as we've seen today. And we have no way of controlling for all the variables that will affect how policies are implemented throughout its life cycle. This is why I always consider optimization a dirty word. And I know I'm probably not making friends when I say that. I certainly don't make friends when I'm presenting this to engineers at Cornell because that's pretty much their bread and butter. Is computational optimization. But when you're optimizing social systems, can anyone guess what happens? Any takers? Go ahead. That's exactly right. You wind up optimizing for some specific ideology, right? And then it becomes incredibly biased. So that's one important factor. But from a mathematical perspective, is there another reason why you wouldn't want to optimize social systems mathematically? Go ahead.
I mean, there are many answers. One of them could be you might reduce redundancy.
So you are going to be there's mountains of uncertainty, right? So you're going to be very precise, but you're going to be precisely wrong. And it's much better to be approximately correct than precisely wrong, right? And also you need to balance those different model purposes. Who is this then getting into the hands of? Who is then actually being, who is the one who's manipulating this model once it leaves the hands of the person who's developing it, right? Very often I'm in the room with policymakers who want to optimize the system for some specific policy goal that I'm like, ew, get your hands off my model. Okay? And so in that way, we wind up building these policy simulators in that it's in a workshop setting, right? So we wind up facilitating it in a way that not say, here's your decision-making tool, here's the answer to everything you want to know about this system, but more like, here is a facilitation device that can help you make decisions, and we can we can explain what is behind the user interface in order to explain specifically with different feedback that's in the system. Right. So I do a couple of different modeling types, and I usually do them together in integrative assessment models. But I want to highlight one for this presentation, which is system dynamics. Pierre, Alex, and we just did a presentation for the European Commission, and they were very much interested in the system dynamics point of view, so I thought it would also be really important to impart all of that to you. So what's going on in there is very heavy into the system dynamics modeling world. It also is very friendly with agent-based modeling, for instance, if you're familiar with that. But system dynamics modeling starts with a problem over time, which is why it works really well with the systems engineering approach to developing a solution to some problematic behavior, because it's starting from the problem and then going backwards from there. So I like to use wind. So even though I'm at Cornell, I spent all of my adult life in Norway. I did all my graduate work there. I worked at a couple of research institutes there, and then from there I went to Cornell. But I like to pick on Norway a lot too because I have a Norwegian husband and I feel like I'm allowed. And when it comes to wind energy in Norway, I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but even though Norway is pretty environmentally progressive politically, they really, really don't like windmills, especially if they can see them. And if you're familiar with this term, it's called NIMBYism, not in my backyard. They like renewable energy, but they don't like that is spoiling their beautiful nature. It's all wrapped up into this concept in Norway called friluftsliv, where they feel like that's part of their cultural identity is being one with nature. So anyway, you can see then, this is for Europe in general, but this is coming from Wind Europe. But we can decide that if you're trying to make a green transition, and if we're talking about digital transition, you need to really start with energy, because that's a huge problem in the life cycle. So you want to move to renewable in order to reduce that environmental impact, as Olivier pointed out. And since this is a problem, then how are we going to fix it from there? So using system dynamics, so energy transitions and policy systems, what do you even do with that? How do you even start with a problem like this and then attempt to build a policy simulator with that? So I'm going to give you the quick and dirty of the process of how that happens. So this roughly looks like what a system dynamics model looks like for wind energy or for energy transitions, but you'll see wind is up there. So system dynamics is very concerned with stocks and flows. We want to know about the amount of capacity and what would increase the capacity for wind energy. So if you can think about it in terms of development of an industry, so then you're talking about industrial design, you're talking about networks, right? But you're talking about it over time, not just one point in time. And you're trying to find different ways, so here comes the policy, to increase that capacity so this starts going up over time. So yeah, you can't see my mouse, but if you see up here, that's wind there, and that's the wind policy. So that would be the place that we would start building out different variables and elements in order to affect what's in that box there. So then how do you build that out? And we're going to come to the actual how with stakeholders in a moment when I explain what living labs are. But what we need to come out of that living lab experience is something that looks like this in a very generic way. So we're looking at this from a socio-technical systems theory perspective, which actually comes from the social sciences. It doesn't come from engineering. But what we want to do is look at different levels. For example, the socio-technical system landscape. What is there? And this is really where the what of what the two of you were talking, or not, you haven't talked yet. Well, up here, Alex, is always the what, and I'm the how. But coming before this, determining what industry are we looking at in order to develop, what specific technology are we looking at, because I don't deal with the what, I only deal with the how. So from there, what does the landscape for that specific technology look like now? And how can we model the actual parts of it? How are the connections now that we were seeing presented? What do these networks look like? And how do we get them to then change in order to get to that going up? And you use system dynamics modeling for one fundamental reason. Because like modeling types, they're a bit interchangeable. If you're looking at behavior over time, you might ask, why don't you just use agent-based modeling? The reason is because system dynamics modeling is the strongest modeling type we have for evaluating feedback in systems. And when you want to evaluate, we've heard a lot of talk too, here and there, snatches of words that things like reinforcing behavior, balancing behavior, those are all feedback loop mechanisms. And those are the things that we are trying to affect, adjust, manipulate, whatever word you like, when you are implementing policy. When you're implementing policy that has high systemic innovation potential. You want to change the feedback in the system so that the behavior of the system itself emerges without you forcing it either to do something at the end. For example, carbon capture and storage. This system, we can produce theoretically, we can produce as much carbon as we like, or CO2 equivalent emissions, and we can get the desired behavior we want in the graph because there's a technology fixing it, and nothing has to change in that system. So I'm not here to knock CCS, but I want to just highlight it as an example of something that would have low systemic innovation potential. So if, for example, you wanted to change the system, the social system now, with the technology, to produce what you wanted to produce, you have to do things that manipulate systemic feedback. And it's hard to know how this exists there. And this is where the stakeholders come in. Okay, so we start with, up on the left there, that's what we're simulating, right? Set of ordinary differential equations. Nothing super fancy about that, other than we are trying to quantify things that are not normally quantified. This simulates a behavior, a problematic behavior, that gives us what we call our dynamic hypothesis. This is, then we know we have a system that more or less accurately represents the problematic system. And this is the place in which we can start to build policy. And here, down at the bottom, because we're considering optimization a dirty word, we're going to look at different policy ideas. But even if you just pick one policy idea of how you think, this is the one. This is the one that is going to be this, that's going to save us all. When you start implementing it, it's broken down not as a single variable. It's like, here's your wind policy. You have to think about how that policy works in real life. What needs to happen for that policy to exist and then successfully implement? And once you start breaking that down into different variables in this socio-technical system, you start seeing throughout its life cycle different things that need to change in the policy design. Because when you develop policy, you're right at the beginning of the life cycle of that policy system, right? You're in the conceptual design stages. But you still have to make decisions about that, how it's going to affect those different stages in the life cycle. And because there are so many unknown variables in social systems, as we said, you can optimize, but you'll be precisely wrong. Being approximately correct, you're creating scenario pathways. What is the different likelihood of different desirable behavior levels happening? And then, of course, you can use statistics and look at the probability of each of those happening. Right. So this is a paper that I did on bioeconomy transitions. These are 3 different feedback loops. So this was built off of it wasn't a living lab, it was a stakeholder workshop only. But what we did as part of that is we were getting stakeholder feedback about different industry types. So when you have stakeholders come into a room for a workshop, everybody likes to talk about their particular expertise. And that's what you don't want. What you want is you want to elucidate both their individual and community level knowledge about how their existence is, let's just say. So basically their mental models. We want to walk the line of what it is that we are trying to change through policy. And then by doing that, we can start mapping things out that look a lot like this. And then we identify feedback loops in that system that we either want to cut because they're problematic, or we see opportunities to create feedback loops because it will allow for desired behavior to emerge. So there's a lot going on with living labs in EU research projects right now, and there's a lot of different definitions of that. So, and I don't want to get in like a definition war in case some of you are in different circles. But essentially, we do a set of stakeholder workshops like I described, and what we're doing is a model building process together with the stakeholders themselves. We're doing this in essentially an exploratory fashion in the first go. Then we start quantifying things and bringing it back to the stakeholders and showing them the system architecture and then what the simulation looks like. Very often I'm really just translating qualitative data that came out of those workshops and turning it into a set of equations to represent that system. Sometimes the stakeholders are like, no, that's not how it is, and then we have to go back and we have several different rounds of this. We have in the room, for instance, policy decision makers that are usually in the room, but we also have lots of different just, locals in the community, in rural communities. And what happens in that environment is that we wind up creating, through the exercises that we have, a shared vision for the desired policy that they then are coming up with themselves. So even if you start off with a policy idea, the stakeholders become part of the policy design. This creates ownership. This allows different social structures to form actually in the system you're looking at. I think I'm running out of time, so, but I usually get this question about data, but I can save it for the questions. We use, as I said, a lot of qualitative data to build these models. We use a lot of statistical data in order to initialize them, but they are not data-driven. We're not looking at huge data sets here. We're looking at how systems work and then creating system architecture to represent that mathematically. So we do work with a lot of things that are difficult to quantify. I mean, how do you quantify, for example, like cultural identity, which is actually a big problem when I'm trying to model this for wind energy in Norway, right? How do you make a NIMBY model? How do you do this in a way that is actually accurate or accurately representing reality? Obviously, we come up with a couple of different mathematical strategies to do this, but the most important part of that is we're doing it in a way that allows the stakeholders themselves to understand what we're doing and then give some face validity for how we quantified it. Right, so I'll leave that for questions, and thank you very much.
Questions, comments?
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have just a short question. You have said several times that you are interested in innovations that are the potential to be systemic or something like that.
I'm sorry, I hear very badly.
Sorry, I can try to speak louder. It's also my specialty. I was just a short question is that you've talked that you are mostly interested in innovations or policies that are have the potential to change the system as a whole. And my question is, how do you know in advance which are the politics that have this potential to change? I mean,
yeah, like how high it is.
Yeah, because,
yes.
Because you put the example of carbon capture as not potential, but you talk about windmill, and if without having no knowledge, I don't see how carbon capture is not systemic, and windmills it is systemic, because to me, it's just a way of production electricity, so it's just...
We can keep on producing, right? We don't have to change who we are. That's an excellent question and great insight. So how do you know? When you're looking at this system, let me go back to this one. Yeah, this one's good. What happens in a society that has to change to 100% renewables? Does it immediately act the way it does now? Is there changes in the behavior that have to happen in order for that, first of all, that industry to be developed, but also just common users, energy users, that's all of us, things that we have to change about our behavior in order to have that be our energy source, right? Can you say that about renewables, that we're just swapping it out? I don't think we can. And so, for instance, when I look at specifically Norway and I look at wind, I have to, in order for them to even accept that, I need to completely change how their cultural identity identifies with energy use, for example. That fundamentally changes who they are. So a lot of what we do in modeling of this is we're modeling perception. We're modeling how information flows from one source to another and how that works in different kinds of feedback relationships. And what sits on the bottom are people's fundamental values, right? We don't want to change who they are as a person, right? I don't want you to value certain things more than other things. But what sits on top of that is perception processes with information feeding in where they're mixing in order to have an opinion of something. And when I'm looking at something that has high systemic innovation potential, it's that process that winds up changing. Because what happens is in Norway, in order for that to be successful with wind, They need to actually look at the windmills themselves, realizing that this is something that is good, that you're perceiving this as valuable, and then I need to change my behavior in order for this to be successful. So the structure of the system changes itself. Now you might be thinking, well, they don't actually have to change their energy consumption, right? Which is where I think your question was really going towards.
Yeah, partially. It was just to know how to identify this systemic potential stuff. I mean, you said the sentence again, policies with systemic implications or something like that.
Yeah. Systemic innovation potential winds up having to affect energy consumption when you're switching to renewables, because what happens when you have over time, see, this is where the time dimension comes in, because now we're always looking from our own perspective and what's happening right now. But what happens when you have to change energy mixes? What happens to countries? Yeah, it becomes problematic, and they need to start changing their behavior of how then the reality of that can produce a desired behavior. They make a commitment. A commitment doesn't lead to a behavior unless they actually have to change what they're fundamentally doing. Consumption is only one part of that.
I'm
just going to come out.
Question is, how do you calibrate your models? Because
that's a great question. No,
because I mean, in terms of knowing a little bit in public economics, actually there's a huge literature on how people reveal their preference, how they declare, and the fact that what they declare may not necessarily coincide with what they really think and how they're really going to react to a policy. So
that's an incredibly important point.
How do you take that into account?
Yeah. So in engineering speak, this is what we call verification. This is the verification process so that you can build robust, reliable models. I'm just going to, obviously, I don't have a full-blown model up here, but I'm just going to pretend that I had just simulated that behavior. This is actual real-world behavior. This is just data. If I can produce a model, this is one point of verification. If I can produce a model that then reproduces that behavior, this is what we call reference mode behavior, then we can say that I have a certain degree of reliability in my model. But we do this, for example, with, my phone is going off. We do this for many different variables that are in, so each of those boxes are what's called a stock. Those stocks then have a behavior over time, and also all the variables in there are also simulating behavior. And where we do have real-world data in the past, in order to judge the robustness of the model, that's how we're verifying or calibrating the model. So we're always starting at a point in time that's, for example, 10 to 20 years in the past. And then when we do actual simulation of future behavior and seeing the effects of policy, that's when we start going into the future.
Yeah, but precisely, I mean, microeconomists have been dealing with this kind of things for many decades now. So, and the problem is precisely that you realize that when you deal with social interaction, you cannot infer future behavior from the past because there is strategic behavior from actors. So how do you deal with this?
Yeah, but this is also part of the problem of where we're not actually optimizing anything and why we wind up creating different scenarios, because we don't know. We can only create simulations of different scenarios of different possible futures, and then seeing what the probability of those different futures are once we go past the present in the simulation. So the answer is there isn't one. So the answer is really there is no answer. There is no way to do that. At least not one that I found that's reliable. They're not crystal balls, they're tools.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
It was related to the first one by Joan. when you were talking about carbon capture storage technologies, I was thinking what was going to be the role of big companies, big oil companies, etc. But because you insisted a lot in Norway, I kind of changed my question to how do you integrate in the behavior of these actors that you were talking a lot about their culture, this cultural thing that you're trying to capture. The fact that Norway is a rich country in oil. And part of the, even though I'm sure everybody's going to say, yes, we want more renewable, if we can have more carbon capture technologies and still producing oil, it would be that bad either.
Yeah, they're big proponents of CCS, so Norway.
How you integrate that? Is that part of their Norwegian culture also? Is that, we are rich?
Like, how do you internalize that kind of?
I mean, you're talking a lot of not in my backyard, but I think for Norwegian and other countries that are rich in oil, they say, well, we have that, and that's part of.
This is just how it is.
That's how it is, and our revenues are going to get from their exploitation.
So this is a bit what I mean. This had to do with. It was based off U.S. renewable energy transitions, but what I wanted to just highlight are these lock-in loops, because that is really what you're identifying here, is when you're working with a system that's so locked into that. It's what we call path dependency at that point. And then what happens is that any policy that has to come up against that has a huge potential for failure. And you're not going to make any gains in your problematic behavior if you're trying to break something or still work with a system that's locked into something without changing something fundamental about how that lock-in feedback loop works. So I'm not saying that I have an answer for that, but we do build that in there. If I had an answer for that, maybe that would be really awesome for the world. But I mean, you're right. Economies are locked into certain types of production, and they benefit from that. But they also benefit by developing new industries, as we've been talking about today. But even though Norway is locked in, they do have this strong environmental progressive policies. They do care, and that's always been considered this, paradox of Norway, right? Is that they really, the connection between nature and oil. And when you have it like that, and you're spelling out the social system in terms of feedback loops, what change are they actually producing with policies? And if you're testing it out in that kind of system, you'll probably see that it's not having much effect. A lot of this winds up just being greenwashing. So, yeah.
No, I learned a lot already. Taking the systemic approach, right? So I was wondering, because here you have a topic in where you talk about radical change, and societies really want to move in a very different direction. When you apply that to a systemic approach, I would say let's say a system has an inherent tendency to avoid radical change, right? Because you don't know where to start with. So what is your experience so far when you use this type of instrument to actually develop radical breakthroughs, right? And
develop what?
Radical breakthroughs. So to leave behind path dependency, right? Is that possible when you actually apply a systemic approach like this?
I think one of the most valuable parts of this is not kind of the end product of the tool itself. It winds up actually being more about the process of building it with the stakeholders, yes, and the learning and the transformative natures of living labs themselves. Yeah. So if I were to give here's this piece of software, to help you make decisions, you already have all of what you want done, and you're just trying to test out and see, and if it doesn't happen the way you like, then you're going to just disregard it. It's not going to be relevant, which is why I would never use this with anybody that actually wasn't part of the process of building it, or at least part of that ecosystem, right? Because and this is also part of why this whole thing with the European Commission is starting now, is that it really is a matter of having a systems thinking approach, or understanding how policy works as a system on social systems. And that clicking tends to be enough, regardless of the actual model and software that you developed. Right. So.
Can I have another question? Okay, because we also talk a lot about differences in Europe, right? So if you would apply this to Norway, indeed, I think it's a very advanced society that has a high quality of government. If you would apply this to Bulgaria, which is a notoriously corrupt country, what would you do differently, right? So what is the same tool very applicable to that type of setting as well?
That's a good question. I actually have students modeling something about corruption in Malaysia right now. But essentially this has a very generic quality to it, right? It's looking at system feedback, regardless if the society is, you know, how developed they are on any kind of index. If there, for example, there is a very strong corruption feedback mechanism that are working in many different economies. And then we're not ignoring that as part of this process. I mean, that's literally part of the model building process that, you know, they're like, well, this is going to happen. So then I'm like, okay, if it happens, that's fine. We're not looking at an idealized world here. We're looking at the world as it actually physically works. We're looking at operational processes. Okay, so if you have to give money to somebody, or money is leaking out of something, and that affects how, for instance, an industry is developed, that's shown through how this modeling process works. Because what it's specific to is system feedback, not its application.
Yeah,
okay, I think we're really badly over time.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Okay, so we are gonna hear the last presentation, which is Pierre Alexandre. Actually, we are just on time because the last lecture couldn't come, so we have 20 minutes plus questions.
Yeah, no,
25.
exactly. Can you hear me? That's good. Yeah. No, exactly. You're right. Luis, Nicolas Vialet cannot join us, Olivier said, which means we have half an hour, and I was planning to talk half an hour only. So we're all good. We're all good. Yeah, no question, exactly, no question. If you want question, you ask. So I also have the huge responsibility to be like standing between you and the drinks. So I'll also try to make it as short as possible. And thank you very much for staying till the end and for not having COVID. So that's so far so good. At least not yet. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about a topic that I believe is very important in the context of twin transition, which is about two technologies that, again, according to me, are the most revolutionary technologies that are happening in front of our eyes today. By far, absolutely immense impact on our society, our economy, in the way we live. And these are technologies that actually you've heard about, right? AI and blockchain, you've heard about these technologies. But it's also an immense gap between how powerful these technologies are, how impactful they are on our society, and how little people know about these technologies, like decision makers even, right? Policy makers, politicians, managers at top companies that basically don't really understand the algorithmic principle, but also the implication of these technologies. And here my focus will be, so I recognize I have a bit of a way too ambitious task for like the end of the day, half an hour, which is introducing you to AI and blockchain and looking at the impact on, you know, and asking questions more than giving you answers. So kind of guiding some kind of elementary reflection, which is, are they gonna make us richer, greener, and happier? Big questions, right? So I do believe it's a bit ambitious, but I think it's also important to start talking about it. What's going on? This is not gonna work because I use, oh, you didn't use it. That's right. I just pressed the button. You made it seem so you know, like you were like flowing. It didn't look like you were going back to the computer all the time. That's impressive. I don't have this talent, so I'm not very elegant, so I cannot do that. All right, so, you know, I'm gonna have 5 messages, and they're gonna be written here, so you remember, and that's kind of the point. Simple messages, simple ideas. First of all, they are massive technological and societal revolution, both of these technologies. Now, I mean, I don't have to actually spend too much time on that. Also because, you know, if you've been like aware a little bit of the tech world in the past week or 2 weeks, you heard about the OpenAI ChatGPT. You guys, I know we talked about already. That also has so much implication, right? OpenAI ChatGPT, you heard about it. Incredible, revolution in like cultural products. You see AI everywhere in movies, in books. You know, we talk about AI a lot, basically. You also see that this is a major national policy in terms of like strategy. You know, you have like almost every country in the world has an AI strategy. Is seeing AI as extremely relevant from a strategic standpoint. In China, New Generation AI Plan, you know, made it very clear in the 2017 convention. It was like, we need to be the leading economy in 2 technologies by 2030, and that's AI and blockchain. Made very, very clear. Executive orders of President Trump and then President Biden also make it very clear. Emmanuel Macron, AI policy, Thierry Breton, CHIPS Act also in the Commission. You see it happening. Actually, Anity here in Toulouse is somehow connected to this high-level strategy in France. It's on the agenda. We understand the overall implications. It's also, if you look at the top 100 companies by market cap, and this is Europe, like kind of squeezed in the middle between Asia and North America in general. What you see is like this tech giant. We talk about the GAFA and all of that. You know, Apple, Microsoft, Google here, Facebook, Amazon, Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu. These companies, the massive, you know, revenue-generating companies, massive market capitalization, they're all leaders in AI. They all massively use AI as a key principle for their business model. And essentially, so somehow, you know, this is already something we see in the economy, so it's already there, right? If you look at the funding of startups, you know, after 2020, you know, you see like a lot of technologies that we actually discussed today in detail, and these are the funding rounds, and you see AI at the top as well. It's there, it's massive. The market believes that it has potential. And you see it already in terms of application, right? In terms of like how it works, but I'm not gonna really talk too much about it. But yeah, I'm gonna actually go a little bit, I'm not gonna discuss too much that, sorry. It's gonna be too much. But essentially something I also wanna point out is massive amount of sectors that are impacted by AI. So that's true, in that case, I would say, AI is probably like super high in terms of systemic innovation potential because it really forces also to change the way we do education. Like literally, teaching to these guys, and I literally changed the exam. I mean the assignment from writing the assignment yourself, like the essay, to now you have to write it with ChatGPT with an AI. So that's your body. You write it with the AI, and you have to comment what's going on with the AI. What is wrong, what is good, and then we basically already work in terms of like tandem and copilot, right? And we're gonna have to think about how to combine human and artificial intelligence. And you see, and I've done this exercise. I once gave a lecture of 3 hours just on this slide, just on one slide, going through all the different, for instance, like how does AI work for fraud prevention, right? In this case, how does AI work in real estate? How does AI work, in this case, in online shopping and search recommendation? Literally, all of this, you have like 100 use cases here, and you probably have more than that. Actually, there is much more than that. But all these sectors are going to be impacted, what's interesting, by the same algorithmic principle. So it's a complete GPT, a general purpose technology that is completely changing the way we work, the way we live. So somehow, that's kind of an issue I have when we talk about, we don't really have a choice somehow. AI is there. And I did appreciate a lot one of the first talk by Olivier. I think it raised great questions. But I think in a global context, we don't have a lever somehow to directly answer these questions. So we cannot decide and stop this digital revolution. Like that to me is very, very clear. we cannot decide here at the level of, like, we don't decide for the next generation. We don't decide for China. So this is something that essentially is going to happen, and we're going to have to make sure that essentially that uses green technology, and it doesn't create a world that is too unfair. And these are the levels where we can act. So regulation can act here. But essentially, you know, that's happening, that's moving fast. There is a lot of money behind all this application, and they make us more productive. I mean, there are good reasons why, you know, we're adopting these technologies. If we will drill down on the tasks that are being automated in all these subsectors and applications here, these are tasks that you don't want to be doing. You're happy to automate these tasks. So there are actually good reasons for this movement. So my first point was simple. This AI revolution is massive, you know, and it doesn't look like other technologies. It has some different properties. It's stronger. The impact is stronger. There's more investment, and the amount of sectors that are being impacted are much bigger. Now, blockchain, right? You heard about blockchain as well. I would say, you know, it has a similar potential, and that I know is more like, you know, AI. I think, you know, you can buy it, but also in the context of blockchain. Now, if you look at this, you've probably been familiar with that. You know, that kind of graph that shows basically the market cap of the crypto technology industry. You see that it reached almost like 3 trillion, which is like roughly 10% of gold in terms of market cap. So it's not small, but it's also not as much as gold yet. So it's quite a lot. And what you see is like, you know, some kind of bump and then up and down, and now we're like in the leg going down. Now, my, you know, advice here is like, don't look at this. Unless you're trading and you're interested in making money out of this up or down, you know, you can also make money when it goes down. I won't give you any advice on that. And I will say that doesn't matter. Somehow this is noise. This is noise. It's a bit like looking at the 2001 dot-com bubble, you know, and try to evaluate the technological potential of internet technologies based on the fact that actually the graph looks exactly the same. We are pretty much in 2002 right now, you know, in the dot-com bubble analogy. And then what happened is like it grows again like this, okay? Now, not saying it's going to happen. I do believe it's going to happen, but I'm not saying it's going to happen like in a sense like absolutely for sure, but that's my belief right now. And that every technology creates expectation. The Gartner hype curve, you know, it creates expectation, it inflates expectation. Everybody has like this fear of missing out. There is leverage in the system, and actually blockchain creates a lot of potential leverage. What does it mean in terms of leverage? You know, you buy with your dollars this amount of Bitcoin, right? And then there are exchanges that allow you, if you put this Bitcoin in the exchange, to allow you to borrow more dollars to buy more Bitcoin. So if the price keeps going up, you're getting more and more levered, and that's okay until the price go down, and then you start to be liquidating. That's exactly what's happening here. Liquidation, cascade liquidation, and then essentially, you know, lenders being also liquidated and being squeezed. So that is a complete financial story. And again, that to me is irrelevant here. Basically, you have, like, when we talk about crypto technologies and blockchain, you have different coins running on different chains. And essentially, you know, I'm sure you heard about the story of FTX and the collapse, you know, of like, where went this 8 billion? We lost 8 billion. Where are they? We don't know where they are. So essentially, my point is, like, you all heard about it. But in the case of blockchain, I'm pretty sure that you haven't really heard the full story and why it makes sense. So to make it super simple, AI is all about automating predictions, which is pretty useful. Blockchain is all about automating transactions, which anyone who is studying the economy will tell you that this is something pretty important, transactions. Like the reason why we're here, the reason why we can buy a shirt, we can buy a computer is all about transaction. The absolutely incredible feat of our economic system and our species is to make sure we can enable large-scale, very flexible connection and transaction, right? We're like basically a giant team, completely globalized team. We divide the labor, and then we specialize, and we do that more and more in a deeper level, in a bigger level, which also means we create this kind of economic. I just realized I was not even using that, but it doesn't make a big difference. So it's the same in that respect. So a couple of key points here to understand the technology. Remember, one of my goals is to say, okay, this is our revolution, and I want to tell you something a bit more about the key principles here. And there are a couple of principles that make a lot of sense. And to me, the best way to introduce blockchain is to talk about what is a data set. What is a data set, and how is blockchain a different way to store data and to manage and administrate data? Because at the end, it's all about that. And you see also now the connection between AI and blockchain. So once blockchain will be completely diffused, and that will be like a real standard, which we are not, we're very early here, then you're going to have a lot of data to actually deploy blockchain AI technology on top of that. So the two, they will naturally connect. So essentially here, when you have a traditional database, your bank, for instance, like your bank has data, your financial data, it's managed by a central entity, right? Even your diploma that you're going to have from University of Toulouse or other, or that you have from another university, if I want to have access to my diploma, I have to kind of request information to my, everybody's like, yeah. And that's a massive problem, massive problem. It costs a lot of time to a lot of people. Everybody's like, yeah. So you see, that's kind of an issue that basically blockchain solves, I'll tell you why later. But essentially, point is, traditional data sets, ERP systems in logistics, massively important. They are managed by a central entity. And that is a big problem in many respects. So essentially, they are based on a client-server architecture, and participants need to trust some central third party, okay? The entire web today functions by what we call the platform economy, is nothing. And so, quick reminder of the web. Web 1, I go online, I read Britannica, I get information, it's a one-way street. You connect to the website, you get information. Web 2, the platform economy, you can upload videos, so you can basically read and write. Okay, you upload your videos, you request Uber ride. So essentially, there is an interaction. Okay, the flow of information is dual. There's an interaction here. So that's Web 2. But then it means there are these platforms that are in between the users and the provider, between the creator and who watched the video somehow, right? So that changes everything, but that gives it an immense power. Even Apple has this monopoly, because if I create an app, I need to use the Apple app system, right, for you to download it. So again, Apple takes a nice 30% of all profit of these apps, right? So you have this, we're living in a world completely dominated by the platform economy. By this platform, Uber, Netflix, Airbnb. It is not peer-to-peer. It's labeled as peer-to-peer. It's not peer-to-peer. It's peer, third party, peer. And the third party takes a big amount of the share. For what? For organizing the data, for creating the matches and all of that. Now, why blockchain technology is revolutionary is because it's completely by design an innovation that can function in a decentralized way, in a completely automated way. Right? If you've been like in finance somehow, or running financial task in an organization, there is something called an audit, right? So you have people that are going to verify that you do these things correctly. Again, that removes the human intervention in the way the data is recorded, and also in the way the data is further audited and analyzed. So in the way you insert the data, but also in the way you audit it, it's completely automatized. And I can tell you this is a massive, massive cost. So making transaction automatic and automatically verifiable is a huge news. It's a big news. So the way you transfer control and decision-making to a distributed network works by what we call a decentralized consensus mechanism. And I don't have time to go into that, but it's pretty interesting. And essentially, what is a blockchain? It's a chain of blocks. All right, that's it. That's really what it is. And that's different from a database, right? Now, a chain of blocks means there is a set of transactions here. So I'm going to, it's like, think about it as a page, right? A page has a limited capacity. I'm going to write, Ron borrowed $10, Ron borrowed $20 to Pierre. You basically make a list. And then when the block is full, or the page is full, you go to another page. Here the same. I'm going to put transaction in a block. And once it's full, I create a new block. Now, what you have here is very important, is this hash. The hash is a unique identifier of a block. And the link here is actually, the blocks are not really linked. It's just that you see the previous hash here. So what you have is a series of block and transaction, and you can never rewrite it. Okay, I'm not going to go too much into detail, but that's kind of the innovation here. And why it matters? Because one, it provides complete data integrity, right? Blockchain ledgers are completely immutable. So normally in a data set, and I mean, I've done that a lot. I do a lot of data analysis, and sometimes I delete a part, Johan, that happens to you. Sometimes you delete something and it's like, oh no, that was actually useful. I should not have deleted that. So here it's immutable. You can create and read, but you cannot update and delete. That's really important. So I can go back and look at the entire history of a chain since inception, right? It's big. I don't know if I communicate that, but it's pretty massive in terms of implication. Transparency, so data integrity, what does that mean? It means that when we talk about CO2 emission and environmental performance and stuff like that, there is a lot of faking. You can basically, you can decide not to integrate some stuff. We see like car companies being fined because of that. They're fined because they change a little bit, depending on how you tweak the model and stuff, right? Here, you cannot change it. You cannot make a mistake, or you cannot decide with malicious intent to fake the ledger. It's transparent. That's another part, which means anyone with the right tool and access can verify the data. That means instead of having to call the University of Toulouse or my high school to find my diploma again, what I can do is I can give access right to any organization automatically to query the blockchain and say, hey, go verify for yourself, right? But in an automatic way, means it would take zero time. You can completely integrate that. Security, I'm not going to go too much into that, but there is a big problem when your data is managed by a third party. Imagine that my job is to secure your passwords to all of you, right? And I keep your password on my notebook. If someone takes my notebook, someone has access to all of your data in one shot. That happens a lot. This data breach is a big, big problem. Here, I'm not going to go in detail, but I can tell you, and you can quote me on that. At least what you can quote me is that it's never been hacked. So this blockchain is the one that functions, the real one, not the scam. There are scams, but like Bitcoin, for instance, has never been hacked. It's known to be unhackable, maybe until we get quantum computing, but that I can address it as well. It's not as much of a big deal as you might think. What can be hacked is you. So essentially, to make it very simple, you have a password when you want to access or initiate a transaction. You have a password. It's called a private key. Now, I can go and look over your shoulder, look at your password / your private key, and then steal your money. That happens a lot. You can lose your private key and never have access again to the blockchain. Big user interface, UI problems, massive. But the system itself cannot be hacked, and that's important because in terms of systemic effects, the risk is decentralized. The risk is like each individual has some risk involved there, but it's not like you hack the system once and you get access to all the information, which has a lot of implication also in terms of healthcare in particular. Now, so my first point is these are massive revolution from a technical standpoint. Now I try to give you a little bit of a hint of how the technology works in a very limited time. And essentially, yeah, so to make it very simple here, one of my questions was will that make us richer? Yes, obviously, and I don't think I really have to dive into it. Why? Because if you have a technology that essentially makes us more productive, I mean, go back to innovation economics 101. That's literally that works. Makes us productive, it works. Eliminate, it automatize stuff. It works, and we can see that. So actually, that I'm not even going to talk too much about it. Bigger problem that I see. Massive, massive problem. Is it going to make us richer, basically baking a bigger pie, augmenting global GDP? No problem at all. Like that, hardly, it would be hard to agree. To disagree with that. Now, a massive issue, I believe, especially with these two technologies and any kind of technology that automates stuff, is the amount of inequality that is packed with this complexity, increasing complexity of the system, given this technological innovation. That, I think, is a big issue. So the way I see it is without proper regulation, inequality will skyrocket, especially with these two technologies. So we're talking about feedback loops. We like feedback loops. the entire model of digital, the digital world is built on feedback loops. So, and it's interesting with feedback loops and who wins. So essentially, just to make it very simple, but the world is super, super unequal in terms of income inequality, in terms of market share of companies. The world is incredibly unequal. Essentially, it's not like a normal distribution. It's more like one takes it all, and then the rest basically eat the crumbs. And if you look actually at the search engine world, there is Google, there is Baidu, that's it, right? Baidu for the East, for China, and Google for the rest. There is no European Google, not at all. It's ridiculous. There are attempts, but it's way too small. So by the way, Europe completely missed the digital transition, entirely. Now, what's interesting is that the way feedback loops work and create inequality doesn't even have to do with any kind of superior skills at the beginning. So essentially the point is there is a massive gap between the skills that you have or the quality of your product at first and the rewards you get. There is disproportionate. It's not like work hard and you're going to get a higher grade at the exam. No, that's not the way it works. Like you might work very hard and there is still someone like Bill Gates or creates Microsoft, and this Microsoft gets a disproportionate amount of attention. So it's not like Bill Gates is 1,000 times or 10,000 times smarter than any engineers. It's like it's all about this feedback loop that if you iterate enough, create this inequality. So the starting point is you can create a better product. You can have better marketing, being known, like can be completely random, right? But what happens is that as soon as you generate more a bigger user base, more customers, what happens is you also get more data. And this blockchain and AI, it's all about data, data, data. Once you get more data, what happens is like that's when you start to have a better algorithm. Better algorithm, better product, more customers, more data. Now that, if you spin this wheel enough time, eventually you can massive gap between companies. And the crazy thing is, for this feedback loop model to work, you don't even need Google to be even better at this stage in iteration number 1. That's the, and you achieve a technological standard and you have network effect kicking in, it's too costly to switch. All of that is not new at all. It's just magnified in the digital world. Why also? Because you can compete globally, which means this network effect and this winner takes all, they have a very distributed customer base and a very centralized location of knowledge production. Ron showed that very well early on. So, and then I could go on because there are different dimensions for why these technologies are connected to inequality. But they, by nature, they really generate massive inequality between cities, between countries, between individuals, between organizations. It's a massive problem and it's structural. That's kind of the point here. It is structural, which means we have to understand that. We have to design policies that basically compensate for this issue. We have to. Otherwise, inequality will keep rising, purely structurally. Now, more complex, important point here is, trying to see how good I'm doing with time, but the demand for energy will go up. Again, the demand for energy here, we saw that with the slide of Olivier, Erika mentioned that as well, and I think we all see that, it's hard to find data where the overall demand for energy in the digital space doesn't go up. So essentially, we're going to have ways to reduce energy usage. That's something that is working somehow, but overall, I think Olivier said that early on. He said in the past, we didn't really manage to cut emissions, with technological progress, essentially, we make marginal improvement, sure, and we create more and more, and we use more and more for less and less, but still overall, we're not getting to cutting our emission at the global scale. I'm not talking about France again. And then depending on how you measure it, I think you said that also, Erika, but then connecting to the CO2 and complexity, one issue here is where do you cut your value chain, right? So if I buy a computer here, or if I start creating a computer, but then the dirty part of making a computer are outsourced somewhere else, then within the complex country, you don't see the CO2 emission, but it's still in the value chain. So depending on how you measure it, that is a very complex issue. So clearly, my point here is and based on my limited knowledge, this is less of my expertise, to be clear, but based on my limited knowledge here, AI, blockchain, will increase the demand for energy. Like I don't see overall. But there are good news here as well. The good news in the case of blockchain in that case is the lot of verification that require, I'm going to say it in a different way. But essentially, what did I have here? Yeah. So here I was showing you, as every time Tesla trains an AI, for instance, just there is a cost. So Tesla is a green company or not? Like that's a big question, right? Batteries, are they like really dirty or clean? You know, that's a big question. But like they also, anyway, AI energy usage. So there is a 70,000 hours that you need basically to run one GPU to essentially train your neural nets every time there is a training, right? How much CO2 emission that is? It's basically 10 tons. Well, that's a lot. So AI, machine learning, all this data crunching, because AI is like brute forcing data essentially, right? It's not like, it's really using a massive amount of energy. Blockchain the same. In the proof of work, the most powerful, secure consensus mechanism, it's very energy intensive. So right now, we're in technologies that are very energy intensive. Now, oops. The minutes, perfect. I want to make one point that I think is important. And I was at an event organized by the UN on essentially bringing together really top leaders in policy, business, and science to talk about climate change. Again, like the UN is doing that a lot. And I had someone that was working on climate change for 30 years, and the guy was like, he looked like someone very tired physically. And he said, I've been coming to this type of event for the past 30 years. I keep telling you the same story. Our Earth is sick. And every year, I'm telling you it's sicker and sicker and sicker. So, and that, this guy was literally, he was showing me papers he wrote in the 70s. It haven't changed much, right? So essentially, I don't buy that we can really cut our demand for energy and change our habits. I don't buy it, just don't buy it. It just empirically never really worked. It's marginal, you know? It's more like, okay, anyway. The point here that is important is that it's very easy to run these networks on green, renewable energy. And another big point at this event that was made was that we didn't have enough investment in green technology, right? There's a lagging investment. So you show how Europe is doing well in green technologies. But if you look actually of the amount of money invested in green compared to digital, you know, it's a 1 to 30, right? Google invests almost 1 billion a year in AI, directly in AI, right? We don't have this amount for like clean technology in any company. So essentially, the important issue here is that you can, by regulation, ban the use of blockchain, the use of fossil fuel, for instance, to power the blockchain. And then what you can do is you can make mandatory, by the way, you don't want to regulate blockchain in the sense of banning this technology because the upside potential is too high. What you want to do is to make sure it does not increase the consumption of dirty technologies. One of the issues when you do that is that you can tap in resources that now cannot be used. Because again, the way it works is like, to make it very simple, you mine with a computer and you secure the network at a different place where the transaction is happening. Which means you can tap into volcanoes, you can use like methanization. There are a lot of sources of energy that are not being used right now. It's like, imagine like a dam and water and powering, like having the ability to power something, but being way too far to a grid to be used. And actually, if you look at in the world where the sun is located, right, for like solar farms in the desert, if you look where volcanoes, like so geothermal energy is located, there are a lot of energy that is not being used. So essentially, if you bring mining is just a way to secure the network, right? Next to this zone, you can secure transaction anywhere in the world. And the value chain, you know, in Walmart in Canada is secure like this. So the kind of light in the tunnel I see here is that that's a way to massively subsidize investment in green technology. Because this is something that you can really replace, and you can run the entire digital sector on electric and then essentially on renewable energy. So that's something where, realistically, I see the demand for energy going up. I don't see us really massively at the global scale cutting our emission, like based on our behavior. don't see that happening. But I see these technologies to be able to be power with source of energy that are not tapped here. And again, I'm not an expert, so I would love to talk about it more. I read a little bit on that, and I would like to dig more, but that's kind of light I see in the tunnel. And then from a regulation perspective, you can demand that the system is power on green technology. That you can do. It's already happening, by the way. It's not in my head, it's already happening. Last thing about happiness. I think that's a really important topic. And essentially, I also want to be a bit more like techno-optimist when it comes to that. Essentially, there's been something happening with technology. It's like it creates better jobs. I'm happy of the kind of jobs we have today. In this room, we have better jobs than we would have had like 100 years ago, or 300 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, right? So essentially what happens is that you have better jobs. Now, this is like the relationship between task and different type of elements of a job. So you can quantify, you don't see anything here. Well, but essentially it's like how tasks in a job or element cluster together in a job. So what it means here, to make it very simple, and here you have the good jobs. Okay, we have a project with the Merkel Foundation and some people in the US where we try to measure good jobs. It's pretty hard. And essentially what you see is that these type of jobs, they come together. So I call that complex skills, but then this is not my definition. It's complex problem solving, judgment decision making, deductive and inductive reasoning, and then they tend to correlate super, super high with what I call appreciation, which is literally labeled as recognition, achievement, working conditions, independence. You have this cluster here, okay? Now, the good thing is robots, and that's physical elements. So there are some jobs that, so essentially it's like how this type of elements here, for instance, data analysis correlate with complex problem solving and stuff like that. Now it's very useful because what you see here is like, then you can rank the quality of elements, okay, that makes a good job. And essentially the good thing is what AI is replacing is mainly elements of jobs that are here. Point of the story, AI will help us to have better jobs because it automates the boring part and leaves you the cool, fun part, right, essentially. Now, that's important. Essentially, that's the first implication. We'll have better jobs. Now, okay, that's a bit, so many things to tell you, but I can. Now, but like here, okay, like I said it and then I stop, okay? Last one, okay. Luis is gonna kick me out at some point. He's gonna be like, stop. No, but like, one thing also, we have to look at the use cases, okay, of these technologies. And one of, to me, like the best use case of blockchain, why it matters, is like we're very privileged here. I have a bank account, several bank accounts actually, and it works. Okay, when I send money to the US, it takes 3 days. Like, why? Okay, it costs me a lot, you know, spread fee, and all, but more or less it works. Now, there are about, depending on how you compute the matter, like 1.7 billion people in the world that don't have a bank account. Why? Because it will cost too much to the financial system to operate this bank account, and these people don't have enough money. But these people, half of them, they actually have a smartphone and an internet, right? That means they could plug in to a completely decentralized financial system. Technically, they do it already. You go to, and then you see the adoption here, by the way. I know it's not the adoption, I should show you the adoption, but the adoption is correlated with that map. So imagine you go to some countries, actually you don't have to go that far. You go to Argentina, well, it's far, but not that far from an economic development standpoint, and you see people are massively moving to the blockchain technology because they don't have a choice, right? That's the only operable option. Remittances, you know, on average, it costs 7% to send money from, let's say, a rich country to a poor country, you know, and Western unions is getting a big cut. So essentially, you can improve the efficiency of almost any system through blockchain technology. And there are some good use cases that can globally make our life much better. That kind of was my point here. The only implication I see, and I'm done here, Luis, I swear, the only implication here is that we're going to have to fight this digital hyperconnectivity, which is creating a lot of mental pressure, a lot of mental health issues, but that's beyond this talk. And that's not only true for AI and blockchain. Thank you. Sorry it was too long.
Do we have time for some question, or we go to the une, deux questions? I have one. Well, go ahead.
I have a question. We already talked about it, but maybe if we see all your theories, I don't know how to call that, in a social aspect, for example, what you said about replacing jobs and social inequalities. I mean, there's a lot, I don't know if it's a question or maybe, but there's a lot to do. I mean, tomorrow we cannot replace all the jobs that some people are doing. We cannot replace it by the AI. It is something about the acceptance by the society. I mean,
yeah, actually, you're very right. It's a great question, and you're right. And that's actually even maybe more a question for Erika that can help us with the how actually to get the societal acceptance and all of that. But to make a very short answer to a complex question, these things happen slowly and through iteration. Like the same when we had like mechanization, and we replace manual physical power with machines. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. Now there's a big difference here. That is happening much more quickly. Much more quickly, and I think we're not ready for that. Our education system is not ready for that. Our education is like catching up, and massively teaching skills to students that are completely irrelevant today. It's hard. So essentially, we're not catching up. But in this case, I mean, look at the implementation of these skills. They're gonna not happen overnight. But these skills, once they're automatized, there is no way back.
but is it not because for example, the ChatGPT,
Yeah.
AI, we talked about it. 5 days, we have more than 1 million subscribers.
Yes.
More than, for example, Netflix, 5 days. Okay, more than 1 million subscribers in 5 days, compared to Netflix, for example, I think it was 3 years, something like that. So maybe isn't it like dangerous because when we see it goes so fast, so it can collapse so fast?
So you answer your own question when you said like it cannot go that fast, and you said, well, actually it's going very fast. So you answer your question number 1, and then question number 2: is it dangerous? Yeah, I think it's going to cause a lot. That was my point on inequality. I think some people are going to benefit from it tremendously, and a lot of people are going to really suffer from that and not going to be able to reskill fast enough to take advantage and be useful in an AI world, economically useful. I will not put it as, I mean, yeah, I would say it's a big problem. It's a big societal problem, massively. We have to start thinking about how to address it. So that's kind of my point. I'm not championing that this is great. That's an issue, and I acknowledge that clearly. So we have to act upon that, 100%. But this is happening regardless, right? Whether we like it or not, it's happening very fast. So what we have to do is to make sure we take the right policy actions. Yeah, and I think it's a risk. It's a risk for social unrest, to put it very simple. It's a risk for like the geography of this content and all of that, and people getting, not very happy, and rightly so.
Maybe just one last question, and then we will continue afterward. Yeah.
Actually, I had 2 quick questions. The first one, was this presentation sponsored by the government of Salvador?
Of what? Of Salvador?
No, that was a joke.
No, but what was it?
Salvador.
The government of Salvador.
Yes.
No, that was a joke. The question was, actually, I'm not at all a computer scientist, but I have happened to read a little bit about from what computer scientists write about the blockchain, and actually there's quite a consensus on the fact that blockchain is an extremely inefficient technology in terms of, precisely because you have all of the ledger to be preserved all around. That's the reason why, the reason why it's energy intensive, it's not only because of mining, but also because you have to keep this information on and on, precisely because you want to avoid to pass from a central. This question of centralization is also a question of efficiency in a sense, especially in terms of energy consumption. So do you think it's really actually realistic to think that actually we could migrate all of our technology on this basis and in a way that is consistent with the environmental goals?
Stefano, great question. I see that you have been indeed reading in the space, and my answer is big yes, without any doubt. Why? Because you're talking about proof of work here. Not proof of stake, not proof of authority, not the Robin model. There are a lot of different consensus mechanisms. And actually, if you move to the private sector, you can have a public blockchain like Bitcoin, or if you're Walmart, you're deploying what we call an enterprise blockchain solution. And that is much easier and much more efficient from a consensus algorithm standpoint. So this already is, and if you look at the 2008 technology and the 2023 technology, it's already getting incredibly more efficient. So I think if we will be like looking at the first iteration of the web browser in 1991, we'll be like, oof, that doesn't work, it's so slow. I mean, my dad told me that, like, it's so slow, why would I use that? Well, the technology improves. And here you have different layers. So you see layer 1, which is all a blockchain, and then layer 2, where you can settle transaction much faster. All of that, you look at the community of developers, like improving this solution. I have no doubt that it's a matter of time until we reach a very, very efficient with, like actually the MasterCard and Visa, TPS, transaction per second, is 250,000 per second. And they cannot scale that with traditional architecture. The projection, again, we're talking about projection here, but through an architecture like this, is in the context of Ethereum, you know, after the merge, proof of stake, 1 million transaction per second. The Lightning Network on top of Bitcoin, second layer of settlement of transaction, 10 million. These are things that are, to me, these are like somehow, engineers will solve that. I don't see, you know, us having this conversation by 2030. I don't see how we just get stuck there. I don't see how, because looking from 2008 to now, I already see like the massive, massive improvements. So to me, that's, but then of course, again, I not have a crystal ball. It's just my feeling on how technology is moving and how quickly it's evolving.
Okay, thank you very much, Pierre-Alex.
Merci à toutes et à tous. On est plus.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're not that many, but come for a drink if you still have some energy, and we can carry on the discussion or consider other projects. Thank you very much to one and all for being with us. Thank you very much, all the speakers. It's in the room next door, the room called Cocagne, just next door.
Merci.